He had built his empire on her silence. Today, she was done being silent. In a gleaming Manhattan courtroom, tech billionaire Eliot Voss arrived with his girlfriend on his arm and a smirk that said this divorce would be over before lunch. A simple signature on a ruthless prenup, and his billion-dollar company would remain untouched. He had already underestimated her for 15 years. He was about to do it one final time, because the woman he called boring, the woman he had erased from his own story, had spent 3 years building something far more dangerous than anything he had ever created. An airtight case, a hidden empire, and the patience of someone who understood that mathematics always balances the equation. If you want to see how a quiet genius dismantled a narcissist's kingdom piece by piece, stay until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The February rain came down in cold silver needles against the tall windows of Manhattan Federal District Court, streaking the glass with trails that blurred the city into an impressionist smear of gray and light. Inside courtroom 9C on the fourth floor, the air hummed with the particular electricity that gathers whenever power is publicly at stake. Not the solemn weight of justice being served, but the crackling, almost theatrical anticipation of spectacle about to begin. Journalists filled the back 2 rows, phones angled for establishing shots. Legal bloggers whispering rapid commentary into their earbuds. Near the mahogany-paneled door, a sketch artist worked in furious strokes, already capturing the room before the principals had even arrived. Somewhere in the upper gallery, a court TV producer sat beside a camera operator she'd spent 3 hours convincing a judge to allow understanding that what was about to unfold in this room would be replayed on every legal podcast and business news segment for months. The bailiff checked his watch. 9:43 a.m. At precisely 9:45, the heavy oak doors swung open and Eliot Voss made his entrance. He didn't walk into the room so much as claim it. 6 feet 2 inches of calculated confidence wrapped in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that had been tailored to make him look like someone who had never been wrong about anything. His dark hair was swept back with artful precision, just enough silver at the temples to suggest wisdom, not enough to suggest age. His jaw was clean-shaved. His posture, the relaxed authority of a man who had given keynote speeches at Davos and TED conferences and Forbes summits, and had never once questioned whether the applause was deserved. The smile arrived a half-second after he did, spreading wide as camera flashes strobed through the gallery like muted lightning. "Mr. Voss over here. Eliot, can you comment on the settlement terms? Is it true about the trust structure?" He raised one hand, an unhurried, almost regal gesture, and the shouted question settled into reverent background noise. The platinum Patek Philippe on his left wrist caught the overhead light, scattering tiny prismatic glints across the mahogany paneling. He'd worn it deliberately. Everything about Eliot Voss was deliberate. Behind him, fitted against his arm, like an accessory chosen to complement the suit, walked Sloan Mercer. 27 years old, 3 million podcast subscribers built on a true crime and luxury lifestyle platform called Unfiltered that had landed her brand deals with 4 Fortune 500 companies. She was dressed in cream-colored silk that moved with the whispering authority of real money, her honey-highlighted hair falling in perfect waves that had taken 90 minutes and the hands of a professional to achieve. Diamond studs, princess-cut 2 carats each, caught the light in her ears. Her smile was practiced to the point of becoming reflexive, chin tilted at exactly the angle that worked best in a photo. Eyes bright with a warmth that did not quite reach behind them. Her grip on Eliot's arm tightened as they swept past the press gallery toward the plaintiff's table. The gesture was unmistakable. "I won." On the opposite side of the courtroom, Nora Voss had been seated since 9:12 a.m. She had not made an entrance. She had simply arrived. She sat at the defendant's table with the complete unnerving stillness of someone who had already decided exactly how this day would end and had nothing left to prove before it did. The fluorescent lights overhead were unkind to her complexion, washing out the warmth in her brown skin and deepening the shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of concealer could fully erase. She had not tried to fix those shadows. She had not tried to signal anything at all. She wore a navy suit, well-tailored, not ostentatious, the kind of garment that said, "I take this seriously," without saying I needed you to notice me. A white blouse buttoned to the collar. No jewelry except a slim watch with a worn leather strap and a pair of small pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. Her dark hair was pulled back in a low, tight bun. Her makeup was minimal, a trace of concealer, a neutral lip, nothing that would invite commentary. On the table in front of her sat 3 manila folders aligned with the precision of someone who measured angles without thinking about it. Her hands rested flat on the table, fingers spread utterly motionless. She did not turn when Eliot and Sloane settled into their seats behind her, did not react to the murmur that rippled through the gallery at the sight of them, did not acknowledge the sketch artist who had repositioned to capture her profile. But her eyes, dark brown, almost black in the harsh light, tracked every movement in the room with the focused economy of a chess master watching an opponent walk confidently toward a trap they had not yet realized was there. Eliot leaned back in his chair with a small creak of leather. He crossed one ankle over his knee and murmured something to Sloane that made her laugh softly, a performance of ease designed for the journalists close enough to observe it. Philip Hart, Eliot's attorney, slid into the chair beside him at 9:47. 54 years old, Harvard Law senior partner at Hart and Kessler, a man who wore $3,200 Italian loafers and carried a single slim briefcase made of leather so soft it seemed to breathe. He set it on the table with the unhurried assurance of someone who had never walked into a courtroom and lost. "Ready to make this quick?" Eliot asked. "It will be." Philip did not look up from his files. Straight enforcement of the prenup, settlement offer on the table. In and out. She's not going to fight it. Philip finally glanced at the defense table at Nora sitting motionless with her 3 folders. Something crossed his face too briefly to name. "Her attorney is Diana Walsh. She's sharp. But the prenup is airtight. There's nothing to fight." Across the aisle, Diana Walsh was already on her feet as the bailiff called the room to order. She looked nothing like Philip Hart. Where he radiated Ivy League polish and the confidence of someone who had never needed to claw for anything, Diana projected something harder and more purposeful, the honed edge of a woman who had come up through public defense and fought for every case she had ever won, 49 years old. Gray threading through black hair, she hadn't bothered to dye wearing a suit she'd had for 6 years and a battered leather messenger bag that had seen the inside of 100 courtrooms. When she stood, the murmur in the gallery died. There was something in the angle of her chin, the set of her shoulders, that commanded a room in ways designer suits could not manufacture. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Ung. The gallery shuffled to its feet as Judge Ung emerged from chambers 62 years old, 25 years on the bench, silver hair cut short, and no-nonsense reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and an expression that suggested she had presided over enough high-profile divorce proceedings to be immune to theater. She settled into her chair, opened the file in front of her, and surveyed the room with the brisk efficiency of someone who had 3 more cases after lunch. "Be seated." She scanned the preliminary filings. "Okay. Case number 2, 024-DV-9201, Voss versus Voss. I've reviewed the materials. Mr. Hart, you're representing the petitioner." Philip rose. "Yes, Your Honor. Philip Hart for Eliot Voss. We're here to finalize the dissolution of marriage based on the prenuptial agreement executed by both parties in 2009. We believe this to be a straightforward matter." "Ms. Walsh." Diana rose. "Diana Walsh for Nora Voss, Your Honor." A slight controlled smile. "And I'm afraid Mr. Hart's use of the word straightforward may prove somewhat optimistic." Philip's smile did not waver. "Your Honor, with respect to Ms. Walsh, the prenuptial agreement is enforceable, comprehensive, and has been reviewed by 3 independent legal analysts who all concur on its validity. Mrs. Voss is entitled to the settlement amount specified therein, which my client is prepared to deliver. She has no legal claim to Voss Dynamics or any associated assets. The company was founded by Mr. Voss using his own capital and expertise. Mrs. Voss was not a founder. She did not contribute capital. She did not develop products. She has no standing to contest ownership." Judge Ung made a note. "I'll hear opening statements before we get into the substance. Mr. Hart, proceed and be concise. I have a full afternoon calendar." Philip stepped forward and the performance began in earnest. "Your Honor, This case is at its core a matter of contract enforcement between two intelligent adults who entered a marriage with clear eyes and clear agreements. He moved with the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed this enough times that it no longer sounded rehearsed. Eliot Voss founded Voss Dynamics in March 2010, 1 year after his marriage to Nora Voss. He built that company from a single idea pursued on a laptop in a Brooklyn studio apartment into a billion-dollar enterprise that today employs 4,000 people and provides artificial intelligence infrastructure to companies across 3 continents. He gestured toward Eliot, who maintained the posture of a man reluctantly present at a ceremony honoring his own achievements. Mrs. Voss, by her own admission in depositions, did not participate in the company's founding. She did not contribute startup capital. She did not write the code. She did not develop the product architecture or cultivate the client relationships that allowed the company to scale. While Mr. Voss worked 16-hour days building something extraordinary from nothing, Mrs. Voss pursued her own interests, which is her right, but which does not entitle her to a share of what her husband created independently. He paced each step precise. The prenuptial agreement is explicit. Any business entity founded by either party during the marriage using their own individual capital and expertise constitutes separate property. Voss Dynamics was founded with Mr. Voss's own money, driven by Mr. Voss's own vision. The company is therefore his separate property, and the prenuptial agreement governs the entirety of the settlement. He turned to face Nora directly. She did not react. Her expression was unchanged, not defiant, not wounded, simply still as though she were watching rainfall. Despite having no legal obligation beyond the terms of the prenup, Mr. Voss is offering a settlement of $5 million, a figure that generously exceeds the agreement's minimums and would provide Mrs. Voss with comfortable, secure support for the remainder of her life. We respectfully ask this court to enforce the prenuptial agreement, grant the divorce, and approve the settlement. He returned to his seat with the satisfied air of a man delivering a closing argument in a trial already won. Judge Ong turned to the defense table. Ms. Walsh. Diana Walsh rose and gathered her papers with deliberate slowness, letting the courtroom hold its breath. Your Honor, she began, her voice quiet, but perfectly calibrated to carry to every corner of the room. Mr. Hart is correct about one thing. This case does involve enforcing valid contracts between two adults who clearly understood their obligations. A pause precise as a rest in a musical score. He's simply wrong about which contracts, which obligations, and which adult actually created the asset in question. The flicker that crossed Eliot's face lasted less than a second. It would have been invisible to most people in the room. Nora caught it because Nora caught everything. Mr. Hart would like this court to adopt a tidy narrative. Brilliant man builds empire. Passive wife contributes nothing. Prenup protects what he earned. It's a compelling story. Diana's voice carried the easy authority of someone about to demonstrate that they had read every page of the book the other side had skimmed. It's also fiction. Philip half rose. Your Honor. I'll allow it, Judge Eng said. Continue, Miss Walsh, but get to the substance. The substance, Your Honor, is this: while Eliot Voss was certainly the public face of Voss Dynamics, the TED speaker, the Forbes cover, the keynote headliner, he was never the company's true creator. Diana let the next beat hang in the air. And more importantly, he was never actually its owner. The murmur that moved through the gallery was the sound of a room recalibrating. Philip was on his feet. Your Honor, that is a genuinely extraordinary claim. Mr. Voss's name is on the incorporation documents. He is listed as CEO and primary shareholder. These are matters of public record. Listed as CEO? Yes, Diana agreed pleasantly. But Mr. Hart appears to be confusing operational authority with actual legal ownership. They are not the same thing. She opened her messenger bag and withdrew a thin document bound in blue legal backing. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A, the corporate holding structure for Voss Dynamics, established in July 2010, 4 months after the company's incorporation. The bailiff carried the document to Judge Ung. She accepted it with the expression of someone prepared to be unimpressed, opened it, and, for the first time since taking the bench, her eyebrows moved. Eliot leaned toward Philip, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried farther than he intended. What is she talking about? What holding structure? Philip grabbed his own copy of the document from his files, flipping pages rapidly. The easy confidence at the corners of his mouth began to dissolve. Diana continued, her voice steady as a metronome. Voss Dynamics operates as a wholly owned subsidiary of VD Holdings LLC, which is in turn controlled entirely by the Chloe Trust named after the Vosses' late daughter. She paused for precisely the right amount of time. The trust owns 100% of VD Holdings. VD Holdings owns 100% of Voss Dynamics. Mr. Voss holds the title of CEO and receives substantial compensation in that role, but he does not own the company. He never has. The gallery erupted. Reporters bent over their phones with the intensity of surgeons. Sloane Mercer's perfectly manicured hand tightened on Eliot's arm, her expression tilting from practiced composure into something more genuinely uncertain. "This is insane," Eliot said loudly enough that the court reporter glanced up. "I built that company. I'm the one who—" The crack of Judge Ng's gavel silenced the room like a gunshot. "Mr. Voss, you will not speak unless you are directly addressed by this court. That is your one warning." Her voice held all the warmth of February concrete. "Miss Walsh, I hope you are prepared to substantiate these claims with something more than a single document." "I am, Your Honor." Diana turned and looked directly at Nora. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Nora Voss smiled. Not the wide, weaponized grin that Eliot wore like armor. Something smaller, sharper. A smile that belonged to someone who had spent 3 years building a proof and was now watching the final theorem resolve exactly as the mathematics had always promised it would. "Mrs. Voss controls the Chloe Trust," Diana said simply. "She is the sole trustee with complete and unconditional authority over all assets held within it, including Voss Dynamics." The silence that followed was the kind that arrives in the space between lightning and thunder. The event had already happened, but the sound hadn't caught up. Eliot surged to his feet. "That is impossible. I didn't sign anything that, Mr. Voss." Judge Ng's voice could have etched glass. "Sit down." He dropped into his chair as though the word had cut his strings. Beside him, Sloane had gone pale beneath her contoured makeup, her phone gripped in both hands beneath the table. Philip recovered faster than his client. "Your Honor, even accepting the existence of such a structure which we will need to verify independently, it doesn't alter the fundamental question of who created the intellectual property. The algorithms, the code, the innovations that gave Voss Dynamics its value, those came from Mr. Voss's expertise and his alone. Ownership structures can be arranged in any number of ways, but you cannot restructure who actually built something." "An excellent point," Diana said. "So let's discuss who actually built what." She reached into her messenger bag and withdrew a second document, older, the pages slightly yellowed at the edges. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit B notes from a meeting between Eliot and Nora Voss at the Blue Anchor Diner in Brooklyn on the evening of January 14, 2010, approximately 2 months before Voss Dynamics was incorporated." The bailiff delivered the exhibit. Judge Ng opened it and studied it carefully. "What am I looking at, Ms. Walsh?" "A paper placemat, Your Honor, from the Blue Anchor on Atlantic Avenue. On it, you'll find handwritten mathematical notation, specifically the core recursive algorithm that became the foundation of Voss Dynamics' flagship product, the Athena AI platform." On the courtroom's display screen, an enlarged photograph appeared, the placemat slightly grease-stained and coffee-ringed at the corner, covered in dense, cramped mathematical writing. To a non-mathematician, it looked like elaborate decoration. To anyone who knew the field, it was unmistakably a proof layered, elegant, and clearly the work of a serious mind. "Objection." Philip's voice had lost some of its earlier resonance. "We have no basis to verify the authenticity of this document or the date it was created." "Actually, we do." Diana pulled up a second image, the diner's receipt for that evening, printed with a timestamp of 9:47 p.m., January 14, 2010. The receipt was found in Nora Voss's records, and we've had the handwriting on the placemat analyzed by 2 independent forensic document examiners, both of whom confirm the writing is not Eliot Voss's. It is Nora Voss's. A side-by-side comparison appeared on screen, the placemat notation beside samples of Nora's graduate school writing from the same period. Even to an untrained eye, the match was unmistakable. The same cramped precision, the same distinctive way of writing certain mathematical symbols, the same shorthand notations. Furthermore, Diana continued, we have testimony from Dr. Edward Marsh, Professor Emeritus of Applied Mathematics at MIT, who was Nora Voss's doctoral advisor from 2006 to 2010 and served as an informal technical consultant to Voss Dynamics during its first year of operation. Dr. Marsh is prepared to testify that he discussed these specific algorithms with Nora in early January of 2010, weeks before the company existed, and that the mathematical approach shown on that placemat is entirely consistent with Nora's doctoral research in adaptive learning systems. Eliot's hands had found the armrests of his chair. His knuckles were white. That's not she didn't, I developed that. His voice came out uneven, stripped of its practiced cadence. I was the one in that diner. She was just sitting there. She was just... Mr. Voss. Judging's eyes moved to him with the flat patience of someone who had stopped being surprised a long time ago. I will not ask you again. The muscle in his jaw pulsed. Your Honor, Diana said, I'd like to call my first witness. Dr. Edward Marsh rose from the third row of the gallery, a tall man in his mid-70s, slightly stooped at the shoulder with the particular posture of someone who had spent decades bending over papers and whiteboards. He wore a corduroy jacket over a black turtleneck, his white hair standing up in tufts that suggested he had been running his hands through it for the last hour, a habit that anyone who had ever attended one of his graduate seminars would have recognized immediately. He moved to the stand with unhurried, deliberate steps, was sworn in and settled into the chair with the calm of someone who had spent 50 years explaining difficult things to skeptical people. Diana approached. Dr. Marsh, please state your credentials for the record. Certainly. His voice carried a faint trace of the English countryside softened by 4 decades in Massachusetts into something almost indistinguishable from academic American, but not quite. I am Professor Emeritus of Applied Mathematics at MIT, where I taught for 44 years before retiring in 2021. My research focused on machine learning algorithms and adaptive artificial intelligence, specifically self-modifying systems capable of improving their own decision-making processes without continuous human input. I have published 218 papers, hold 22 patents in related fields, and have been cited as foundational in the development of modern reinforcement learning architectures. And how do you know Nora Voss? Nora was my doctoral student from 2006 to 2010. A warmth entered his voice, not sentimental, but the genuine regard of a teacher for a student who had made the work matter. She was among the finest mathematical minds I encountered in my career. Her thesis work on adaptive self-optimizing systems was genuinely original, not incremental improvement on existing frameworks, but a new approach to how learning algorithms could be structured at a fundamental level. Did you work with her on the algorithm that became the foundation of Voss Dynamics? Not in a collaborative sense, no, it was her work, but we discussed it extensively. In February and early March of 2010, Nora came to my office on several occasions to work through some theoretical problems she was developing. The central challenge she was trying to solve was how to build an AI system that could genuinely adapt to new information in real time without needing to be retrained from the ground up every time it encountered data outside its original parameters. Most systems at that point were sophisticated pattern-matching engines. They could recognize. They couldn't truly learn. Nora wanted something architecturally different. Diana projected the placemat image onto the screen. Do you recognize the work shown here, Dr. Marsh? The old professor leaned forward, squinting slightly, then settled back with a small, unambiguous smile. That's Nora's notation system. She always rendered those particular probability distribution symbols. That way it was idiosyncratic to her. And this approach... He lifted a hand toward the screen, tracing the air in front of a specific section of the equations. These recursive feedback loops with weighted adjustment coefficients, that is the exact methodology we discussed in my office. I recognized it immediately. It's elegant, the kind of solution that looks simple once you see it, but which took years of deep mathematical thinking to arrive at. In your professional opinion, does this algorithm form the basis of Voss Dynamics' Athena AI platform? It does not merely form the basis, it is the foundation. When Voss Dynamics published their initial technical white papers in late 2010, I read them within the week. I recognized Nora's mathematical fingerprints on every page. The implementation had been refined, translated into production code scaled for commercial deployment, but the core architecture, the fundamental logic that makes the system work, that is Nora's design. Unmistakably. Could Eliot Voss have developed this algorithm independently? Philip was on his feet before Diana finished the sentence. Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation about another party's capabilities. Dr. Marsh is an expert witness with 50 years of experience in the exact discipline at question, Diana responded calmly. His professional assessment of whether a specific mathematical achievement falls within a specific individual's documented capabilities is precisely the kind of opinion expert testimony exists to provide. Judge Young deliberated for a moment. Overruled, Doctor. Marsh, you may answer. The old professor looked at Eliot directly for the first time. His expression held no hostility, just the measured impersonal clarity of someone evaluating observable facts. Based on Mr. Voss's educational background, which is in business administration, not mathematics, and based on what I personally observed during the technical consultation meetings I attended at Voss Dynamics in its first year, no. I do not believe Mr. Voss could have developed this algorithm independently. The recursive architecture requires a deep specific fluency in advanced calculus probability theory and computational learning theory that takes years of structured study to develop. Nora had that foundation. She had been building it since her undergraduate work at Carnegie Mellon and refining it through her doctoral research. In our technical meetings, Mr. Voss frequently asked Nora to explain concepts to him. She was always the one who understood the system at its mathematical core. The words fell into the courtroom like stones dropped into still water, sending slow, heavy ripples through every assumption the room had entered with. No further questions, Your Honor. Philip approached for cross-examination, but the swagger he had carried through his opening statement had been replaced by something more cautious, the careful movement of a man testing ice he was no longer certain would hold. Dr. Marsh. Isn't it possible that Mr. Voss studied these mathematical concepts independently, outside of formal academic channels? Possible in the abstract, not plausible given the level of sophistication involved. These aren't concepts you absorb through casual self-study. And I would add, he gestured toward the placemat projection still on screen. The notation shown on that placemat was written in Nora's hand using Nora's notation system, and it existed as a complete conceptual framework before Voss Dynamics was incorporated. Whoever created the algorithm, the physical record of its creation, is in Nora Voss's handwriting. But you can't definitively state that Mr. Voss didn't contribute to the algorithm's development. I can definitively state that the core mathematical framework was in Nora's possession in written form before the company existed. I can definitively state that the same framework became the engine of the company's entire product line. And I can definitively state that in 50 years of reading mathematical work, I have never confused one mathematician's intellectual signature for another's. He paused. The conclusion that follows seems fairly obvious. Philip had nothing else to offer. He returned to his seat. Doctor. Marsh stepped down from the stand, pausing as he passed the defense table to give Nora a brief, collegial nod. The acknowledgement between two people who had done serious work together and needed no further ceremony to mark it. Nora nodded back. Judge Ung checked the time. It's 11:52. We'll break for lunch and reconvene at 1:30. Miss Walsh, I assume you have additional testimony prepared. Several witnesses, Your Honor, and additional documentary evidence. Then we'll plan to make substantial progress this afternoon. The gavel fell. Court is in recess. The gallery erupted into the controlled chaos of a room that had just witnessed something it had not expected. Reporters rushed for exits with phones already at their ears. Legal bloggers narrated directly into recording devices. 3 rows back, a woman who had come to observe a routine high-profile divorce was now typing a thread that would have 20,000 retweets before the afternoon session began. Sloane had already separated herself from Eliot by several inches. She sat stiffly apart, staring at her phone, the practiced warmth of her expression replaced by something colder and more calculating, the private face of someone running numbers and not liking the results. Eliot sat motionless for a long moment, the charcoal Tom Ford suit suddenly looking less like authority and more like a costume that had outlasted its role. Marcus? He stopped. corrected himself. Philip, what the hell is a Chloe trust? I never signed anything called lower your voice. Philip gathered his documents with controlled urgency. We need to talk privately, now. You told me this was simple. You told me the prenup was, I said lower your voice. Philip's eyes moved briefly toward the nearest journalist still within earshot. Conference room, 5 minutes. Eliot stood, and for just a moment before the performance reassembled itself around him, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who had spent 15 years telling a story about himself and had just met the woman who had kept every receipt. Across the aisle, Nora gathered her 3 folders with the same precise, unhurried movements she had used all morning. She rose, smoothed her skirt with one clean pass of her hand, and walked toward the private conference room the court had arranged. Not quickly, not dramatically, just forward. She did not look back at him. She did not need to. The conference room was small and smelled of coffee and old paper, the kind of room that had absorbed decades of private negotiations and never quite released them. A window overlooked an air shaft between buildings, no view, no grandeur, just fluorescent light and the muffled sound of the city carrying on without interest in the drama 2 floors below. Diana set her messenger bag on the table and sank into a chair. That went better than the most optimistic version of our plan. It went exactly as the mathematics suggested it would. Nora opened the first of her 3 folders on the table between them, and what lay inside was not at all what the courtroom had seen. It was a decade and a half of documentation. Bank statements going back to 2011, email chains printed and organized by date, meeting notes in Nora's cramped mathematical handwriting, photographs some posed, some clearly taken without the subject's awareness, corporate filings cross-referenced with personal financial records. A timeline that stretched from a Brooklyn diner on a cold January night in 2010 to this room this morning, this moment. Diana studied it. He never read what he signed. He never read anything he signed. Nora's voice was level clinical, the tone of someone describing a variable that had been factored in from the beginning. When I structured the holding company and the trust, I placed the documents in front of him with 3 other contracts, routine operational agreements. I told him exactly what each document was. I used the correct legal terminology. But I also knew that Eliot considered paperwork beneath his attention. That was my job. I was the one who handled the boring details. She pulled one document from the folder, the trust agreement, 12 pages signed and notarized. Eliot's signature swept across the bottom of the final page in the same bold, recognizable hand that appeared on every Voss Dynamics press release. He thought he was signing the employee bonus structure for the founding team, she said. He was in the middle of planning the launch party. He signed everything I put in front of him without reading a single word. A pause. I never lied to him. Every document said exactly what it was. He simply chose not to look. Diana sat back looking at her client with an expression that was equal parts professional admiration and something more personal, the recognition of someone who understood the full weight of what patience like this actually cost. 15 years, she said quietly. You held all of this for 15 years. Nora was silent for a moment, her hands flat on the table, very still. I loved him, she said finally. I know that must seem strange given everything. But in the beginning, before the company grew, before the Forbes covers, before Eliot started to believe his own mythology, I genuinely loved him. I believed we were building something together, that the credit would eventually be shared, that he would see me as a partner instead of infrastructure. She looked at the trust document without particular expression. I kept waiting for him to choose that version of us. What changed? Nora was quiet for a long beat. When she answered, her voice had not hardened. It had simply become more precise, the way a mathematical proof becomes more precise as it approaches its conclusion. October of 2022. He left his phone on the bathroom counter while he was in the shower. A message came in. I wasn't looking for anything. I had no reason to be looking. She opened the second folder. Inside were photographs printed on glossy paper organized by date. Eliot and Sloane Mercer at a corner table in a restaurant, his hand on her knee under the tablecloth. Eliot and Sloane entering a hotel on a Tuesday afternoon, the same Tuesday afternoon that Nora had been in a hospital consultation room, learning that her ovarian cancer had returned for a second time. Eliot and Sloane on the deck of a chartered yacht somewhere in the Caribbean, the kind of trip he had described to her as a necessary investor relations obligation. Diana looked at the photographs carefully. She said nothing for a moment. "He was with her," Nora said, "while I was sitting in a doctor's office being told that the cancer was back. He was on a yacht that my company's trust dividends helped pay for." She closed the second folder with the same clean precision with which she had opened it. "After that, I stopped waiting for him to choose the other version. I became methodical. You documented everything. For 3 years. Every financial transaction I could trace, every lie I could verify, every moment he assumed I was too boring to notice." She touched the edge of the third folder, still closed its contents, not yet revealed. "He thought my silence was acceptance. He had never understood the difference between a woman who doesn't notice and a woman who is choosing her moment." Diana looked at the unopened folder. "What's in there?" "Tomorrow's evidence," Nora said simply. Outside the city moved through its lunchtime rhythms, indifferent, ceaseless, unimpressed by the weight of what was being arranged in this small room with its fluorescent light and its window onto an air shaft. Diana began laying out the afternoon's strategy. The forensic accountant who would walk the court through the corporate structure, the CTO, who would testify about who had actually written what, and the financial analyst whose findings would reframe the entire question of what Eliot Voss had been doing with his company's money for the past 3 years. Nora listened, confirmed each step, and at 1:25 rose to return to the courtroom. In conference room 3B on the other side of the building, Eliot Voss sat across from Philip Hart with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Staring at the trust documents his attorney had finally located in a corporate filing from 2010 documents that had existed for 15 years in plain sight, never examined, never questioned, signed by his own hand on a day he could no longer clearly remember. "How did I not know about this?" His voice came out hollow, stripped of every note of the performance he had spent the morning delivering. Just a man's voice in a small room, suddenly aware that the walls were closer than he had thought. Philip chose his next words with the careful precision of someone who had been practicing law long enough to understand the difference between a client who needed comfort and a client who needed truth. "Because you didn't read it." He set the documents on the table between them, the pages arranged so that Eliot's signature was visible on each one, that large sweeping signature that had appeared on magazine covers and conference programs and product announcements for 15 years. "Your name is on every page, witnessed, notarized, and the document heading at the top of every single page reads, 'Chloe Trust Agreement.'" "She tricked me," Eliot said. "She put it in a stack with other papers, and she told you what you were signing." Philip's voice did not rise, which somehow made it more devastating. "She used the correct legal terminology. She placed it in front of you as a separate document. You chose not to read it." A pause, not for effect, but because Philip needed a moment to decide how to phrase what came next. "That distinction is going to matter enormously in the next several hours. Trick implies deception. What this document shows is that your wife handed you a clearly labeled trust agreement, explained what it was, and you signed it without reading a word because you considered paperwork beneath your attention." Eliot stared at his own signature. He thought about the day he had signed these documents. He had a vague memory of Nora setting a folder in front of him at the kitchen table, the sleek renovated kitchen in the Tribeca apartment he'd had remodeled after the Series B close all white marble and brushed steel and pendant lights that cost $400 apiece. He had been on the phone with his head of marketing talking through the launch strategy, gesturing for her to pass him a pen. He had signed without looking. He had gone right back to his phone call. Nora had gathered the documents and filed them away without comment. He had not thought about them again. 15 years. "The trust is real," he said finally. It wasn't a question anymore. She actually owns the company. She controls the trust that controls the holding company that owns the company, which for legal purposes is the same thing. Philip laced his fingers on the table. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me because I cannot advise you effectively if I am operating with incomplete information." Eliot looked at him. Are there other things, financial structures, accounts, transactions that you have not told me about? Anything that could come out this afternoon that I am currently unaware of?" The silence that stretched between them in that small conference room was its own kind of answer. Philip closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something in his expression had shifted not from professional to personal exactly, but from strategic to something more resigned. "How much? I moved some dividend payments. I was restructuring. It was a tax strategy. I had advisors who, how much?" Eliot set down the untouched coffee. "I don't know exactly. Estimate." The number he eventually said made Philip sit back in his chair in a way that was not technically an expression of emotion, but which communicated volumes nonetheless. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the table rather than at his client. "Eliot," he said in the careful tone of someone delivering a diagnosis, "the woman on the other side of that courtroom has had 3 years to document everything you have done. And based on this morning, I have to assume she has documented it thoroughly." He tapped the trust agreement with one finger. "You walked in here today believing you held all the cards. You signed those cards away 15 years ago and never noticed." He stood gathering his files. "Our afternoon strategy is going to be considerably different than our morning strategy." "Meaning what?" "Meaning we listen. And we do not make it worse." Across the building, Nora sat with Diana in the court's conference room, reviewing the afternoon sequence one final time. The third folder remained closed on the table between them, its contents not yet needed saved for the moment when they would land with maximum effect. Diana went through her witness list. Margaret Thorne, the forensic corporate analyst. Kai Oduya, the CTO, who had been employee number 4 and had spent 15 years translating Nora's mathematics into production code. And then Renata Cruz, the financial investigator, whose 400 hours of analysis had traced every dollar Eliot had moved through shell companies and offshore accounts with the patient thoroughness of someone assembling a map of a labyrinth. "Are you ready for this afternoon?" Diana asked. "I've been ready for 3 years," Nora said. She touched the closed folder lightly, then withdrew her hand. "This morning established the foundation. This afternoon we build the structure. And tomorrow we prove what the structure contains." She looked out the window at the narrow slice of February sky visible between buildings gray and flat and cold, the kind of sky that made Manhattan look like it had been drawn in pencil. Somewhere in the building below, Eliot was sitting with his attorney in a conference room and beginning to understand for the first time that the empire he had spent 15 years claiming as his own had never actually belonged to him. She had not done this out of hatred. Diana wanted anyone who might one day try to make sense of it to understand that clearly. She had not spent 3 years building this case because she wanted to watch him burn. She had built it because the alternative was accepting that her work, her intelligence, the years she had given to something she had genuinely believed in were worth nothing. That she could be erased from her own story, and the appropriate response was to quietly accept the erasure. She was a mathematician. She understood that equations required balance. She had simply decided 3 years ago to be the one who balanced this one. In courtroom 9C, the bailiff was already resetting the room for the afternoon session. The gallery was filing back in more people than before, word having traveled with the speed that only digital media can achieve, rippling out through legal blogs and financial newsletters and technology podcasts, until it reached people who had never intended to follow a divorce case but found themselves unable to look away. Sketch artists had claimed better positions. The court TV camera had been repositioned. A woman who wrote a widely read newsletter on women in the technology sector was composing her second dispatch of the day with the focus of someone who understood they were watching something that would be discussed for years. At 1:29, Nora and Diana walked back through the corridor toward the courtroom. Behind them, from the direction of conference room 3B, came the sound of Philip Hart's voice, measured, professional, stripped of its earlier ease, advising his client in the careful language of someone who had spent the last 90 minutes recalibrating everything they had believed about the case they were about to continue. Eliot's voice in response was quieter than it had been all morning. They walked into the courtroom together, Nora and Diana, and took their seats. 3 folders on the table, hands flat, perfectly still. The afternoon would be worse for Eliot than the morning. The afternoon Nora had always known would be where the real mathematics began. And the numbers, as they always did, would be honest. Judge Ung entered at precisely 1:30, and the packed gallery, fuller now than it had been at any point in the morning, settled into an attentive, charged silence. Word had traveled fast. The courtroom had a different quality in the afternoon light, the gray February sun angling through the rain-streaked windows, at a lower degree, casting long shadows across the mahogany paneling. It felt somehow more serious, more inevitable. Eliot sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a muted gray tie, in place of the morning's power navy, a small visible concession to the changed landscape. He had not recovered his posture. Where that morning he had occupied his chair with the proprietary ease of a man on his own stage, now he sat slightly forward, his elbows close to his body, his eyes moving between his attorney and the defense table with the careful watchfulness of someone trying to calculate what he could not yet see coming. Sloane Mercer sat beside him, though the deliberate closeness of the morning, her hand on his arm, the performed ownership of the gesture had dissolved. She was positioned several inches away, her phone held just below the edge of the table, her attention split between the room and whatever her notifications were telling her about the shape of her public reputation in real time. "Are we ready to continue, counselors?" Judge Eng asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Diana said, rising. "The defense calls Margaret Thorne." A woman in her early 60s rose from the gallery and made her way to the stand with the measured authority of someone entirely at ease with formal proceedings. She was elegantly dressed in the way of old money, a suit cut with quality rather than flash pearl earrings that had probably been worn by her mother's silver hair that she had declined to color. She carried a tablet and a manila folder, both of which she arranged on the small shelf beside the witness chair with methodical precision before looking at the room. "Ms. Thorne, please describe your professional background for the court." "I'm a forensic corporate analyst," she said. Her voice carried the kind of clarity that comes from 37 years of explaining complex structures to people who need to understand them quickly. "I specialize in corporate structure analysis and asset tracing with particular focus on identifying the legal ownership of entities in complex, multi-layered corporate arrangements. I've worked in this field since 1987 and have served as an expert witness in over 240 cases, including proceedings before federal courts in 8 states. Have you examined the corporate structure of Voss Dynamics?" "Extensively." She opened the folder on the shelf and tapped the tablet to bring up her prepared visual. The diagram that appeared on the courtroom screen was a clean hierarchical flowchart, boxes and arrows tracing the corporate architecture from top to bottom. Voss Dynamics Incorporated is wholly owned by VD Holdings LLC. VD Holdings is wholly controlled by the Chloe Trust. The trust was established in July 2010 and names Nora Voss as sole trustee with complete discretionary authority over all assets held therein, including the authority to appoint or remove corporate officers, approve or reject major business decisions, and distribute or withhold profits. She zoomed in on the employment structure section of the diagram. Eliot Voss holds the title of Chief Executive Officer and receives compensation as specified in a standard executive employment contract. He is authorized to make day-to-day operational decisions within parameters established by the holding company. She paused to allow this to land before continuing. He has no ownership stake in Voss Dynamics. He is in the technical legal sense an employee, a highly compensated one, but an employee. Philip rose immediately. "Your Honor, even if this structure exists as described, and we accept that it does, the court should look at the practical reality of who founded and built this company. Corporate architecture can be arranged to say anything. The substance is what matters, and the substance is that Eliot Voss created Voss Dynamics." Margaret Thorne's expression suggested she had encountered this argument before and found it unpersuasive every time. "With respect to opposing counsel, there is nothing theoretical about the holding structure I've described. The Chloe Trust has been an active legal entity since July 2010. It has filed tax returns annually. It has held quarterly board meetings, the minutes of which are part of the corporate record. It has issued and managed dividend distributions. It has exercised its authority and governance decisions on at least 14 documented occasions over the past 15 years. This is not a structure created last month to influence a divorce proceeding. It is 15 years of continuous documented corporate governance. Could you explain, Diana continued, why a structure like this might legitimately be established at the founding of a company? Several reasons are common in practice. First, asset protection. A trust structure insulates core company ownership from personal liability in the event of litigation or business failure. Second, succession planning. The trust ensures that ownership passes according to defined terms rather than defaulting to probate. Third, she looked up from her document, and perhaps most directly relevant here, it ensures that the actual ownership of the company remains stable regardless of changes in the personal circumstances of the individuals involved in its operation, including the dissolution of a marriage. So the prenuptial agreement cannot reach what was never Eliot Voss's separate property to begin with, Margaret said simply. The prenup protects separate property. To invoke it, Mr. Voss would need to demonstrate that he owns something. The Chloe Trust owns Voss Dynamics. Mr. Voss never owned it. There's nothing for the prenup to protect. Eliot's hand moved to his face. He caught himself and forced it back to the armrest. Philip stood for cross-examination with the careful, controlled movement of a man who understood he was operating in constrained territory. Miss Thorne, isn't it convenient that this structure surfaces only now during divorce proceedings? It has been part of the public corporate record since 2010, she said. It did not surface during divorce proceedings. It was always there. It simply wasn't examined. My client clearly believed he owned this company. What Mr. Voss believed and what the legal documents reflect are different categories of fact. I analyzed documents. She said this without apology or particular emphasis. Just the measured delivery of someone who had learned over a long career that feelings did not appear in corporate filings. But doesn't this structure represent a manipulation? It represents a legally established and continuously maintained corporate architecture. Every page of the trust agreement bears Mr. Voss's signature. He had access to independent legal counsel at the time of signing. The documents were clearly labeled. If he did not read them, that is a matter of his own choices, not manipulation by another party. A brief pause. Adults who sign legal documents are presumed to understand what they are signing. That presumption exists precisely to prevent parties from later claiming ignorance of documents they chose not to read. Philip had nothing more to offer on that line. He tried two additional angles, both of which landed with the flat resistance of questions running into facts, and eventually returned to his seat. Margaret Thorne stepped down with the unhurried composure of someone whose work had already been done before she took the stand. As she passed the defense table, she gave Nora a small professional nod. The defense calls Kai Oduya. A man in his early 50s rose from the gallery and walked to the stand with the particular bearing of someone who was profoundly uncomfortable in formal settings, but had decided to get through it with as much dignity as the situation allowed. He wore a blazer over a dark t-shirt, a compromise between business and instinct, and pushed his glasses up his nose as he settled into the witness chair, a gesture so automatic it was clearly a lifelong habit. Kai Oduya had the physicality of a man who spent most of his time behind screens in rooms lit by monitors, lean, slightly hunched at the shoulder fingers that moved as though they were always about to type something. His eyes behind the glasses were sharp and attentive in the way of someone who noticed everything and filed it away. Mr. Oduya, how long have you worked at Voss Dynamics? Since the beginning. I was employee number 4 hired in June 2010 as lead developer. I became chief technology officer in 2015. He shifted slightly in the chair. I've been there for the entire life of the company. What were your initial responsibilities? Taking Nora's algorithm and turning it into production code. That's the simplest way I can describe it. He glanced toward the screen where the placemat image was still available in the exhibit display queue. She had developed a complete mathematical framework, the conceptual architecture for how the Athena system would work at a fundamental level. My job was to translate that framework into software that could actually run, efficiently, scalably, reliably. That's what I did for the first year and a half. Did you work directly with Nora Voss? Every day. She was in the office constantly, more than anyone, honestly. She would explain the math to me, walk me through the reasoning behind specific design choices, debug with me when we hit edge cases that the theoretical framework hadn't fully accounted for. He paused. She was the most rigorous person I have ever worked with. Not demanding in a punishing way, just genuinely precise. She cared that the implementation actually reflected the mathematical truth of what she had designed. She wouldn't accept approximations. What was Eliot Voss's role during this period? Kai chose his next words with the careful deliberation of someone who had thought about how to answer this question before arriving in this room. Eliot was essential to the company's success in the ways that mattered for growth. He was excellent at communicating the vision, explaining to potential investors what the technology could eventually do, building relationships with early clients, making the product sound accessible to people who would never understand the underlying mathematics. He had enormous energy and genuine charisma. Those are real skills. But the actual technical work, the decisions about how the algorithm should be structured, what needed to be prioritized, how to solve the hard problems we encountered, that was Nora. Always. When we hit serious technical obstacles, Eliot would sit in on the meetings, ask questions, and then tell us he had a call with investors. The work was Nora's and mine, and the 2 junior developers we brought on in the fall. Diana pulled up an email chain on the screen. "Do you recognize this correspondence, Mr. Oduya?" Kai squinted at the display, then nodded. "That's from July 2010. I was stuck on the recursive feedback implementation. There was a specific problem with how the system was handling probability adjustments when it encountered ambiguous data, and I couldn't figure out how to solve it cleanly without introducing latency that would make the real-time application unworkable. What happened?" I sent Nora a message asking if we could talk it through. She came to my desk and spent about 2 hours with me going through the math. She showed me a different way to structure the weighting coefficients here. He pointed toward a section of equations visible in the email. "This is her explanation. This is what allowed me to finally solve it. Without that, we would have shipped a product that worked in test conditions and failed in real-world deployment." He looked at the exhibit steadily. "That's not a small thing. That would have been the end of the company." "So, who actually built the Athena AI system?" "Nora designed it," Kai said without hesitation. "I implemented it. Our team refined and expanded it over the years that followed, and Eliot took it to market." He paused. "We all contributed something real, but Nora was the architect. Everything else we built, every product, every contract, every dollar the company has ever generated traces back to her foundational work. That's not an opinion. That's the technical history of the system." Philip approached for cross-examination with the focused, narrowed energy of a man who had accepted that he could not move the mountain and was now looking for smaller, workable terrain. "Mr. Oduya, you mentioned you hold a 2% equity stake in Voss Dynamics granted in 2015. "That's correct." "So you have a direct financial interest in supporting Mrs. Voss's claim to the company." Kai looked at him with the mild, unhurried expression of someone who had anticipated this question and found it less interesting than its author believed. "I have a financial interest in the company continuing to succeed. It has succeeded at a remarkable level under the current structure. What I don't have is any incentive to testify falsely about technical history that I personally lived. I was there. I wrote the code alongside Nora's mathematical guidance. I know exactly who did what and when." "But you're choosing to testify for Mrs. Voss." "I'm choosing to testify truthfully about what I observed over 15 years of building this system with my own hands." His voice was patient, almost gentle, the tone of someone explaining something to a student who was not quite following. "I'm not performing loyalty. I'm describing technical reality. Those are different things." Philip tried 2 more approaches and found them both flat. Kai stepped down, pausing to exchange a brief private look with Eliot as he passed the plaintiff's table, something that was not quite apology and not quite acknowledgement, but which carried the weight of 15 years of shared work and the complicated grief of watching someone you built something with discover that they never really understood what they had built. Eliot did not return the look. He stared at the table. Judging checked the time. "Ms. Walsh, you indicated earlier there was a third component to today's testimony." "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call one final witness before we address the documentary evidence I mentioned this morning." "Proceed." "The defense calls Renata Cruz." A woman in her mid-30s rose from the gallery's second-row conservative gray suit, tortoiseshell glasses, and the precise, unhurried posture of someone whose entire professional value rested on her ability to be unimpeachable. She carried a tablet, and a thin binder settled into the witness chair and arranged both items on the shelf with the efficiency of someone who had done this in 100 courtrooms and would do it in 100 more. Ms. Cruz, please describe your professional background. I'm a forensic financial analyst at Cruz Investigative Group. I specialize in tracing hidden assets and analyzing complex financial structures in high-stakes civil and criminal proceedings. I've been in this field for 12 years and hold certifications in forensic accounting and international financial investigation. Have you examined Eliot Voss's financial records? Extensively. Mrs. Voss provided me with access to corporate accounts, personal banking records, and a substantial collection of supporting documents she had assembled over the preceding 3 years. I spent approximately 420 hours conducting a comprehensive review of Mr. Voss's financial activities from 2020 to the present. She tapped her tablet. A complex web of connections appeared on the courtroom screen, boxes and arrows in 4 colors showing the flow of money between corporate accounts, shell entities, offshore holdings, and personal accounts. It had the organized elegance of a diagram by someone who had spent a great deal of time making complexity navigable. What I found was a multi-layered financial structure designed with a single primary purpose to systematically move money out of Voss Dynamics and the Chloe Trust and into accounts under Eliot Voss's personal control in ways that were intended to be difficult to trace and impossible to attribute to intentional fraud. Philip stood. Objection, Your Honor. Intended attributes a state of mind. I'll rephrase, Renata said calmly before Diana could respond. The structures were built in ways that are consistent with deliberate concealment. Whether intent can be proven is a legal question I'll leave to the attorneys. What I can speak to is the architecture of what I found. Judge Young nodded. Overruled. Continue. The scheme has 3 principal components. Renata highlighted the first cluster on the diagram. Component 1, shell corporations. Between 2021 and 2024, Mr. Voss established 7 separate business entities. Nominally independent consultancies and investment vehicles all incorporated in Delaware with registered agents but no physical offices, no employees, and no documented business activity beyond receiving payments from Voss Dynamics. Eliot shifted in his chair. His attorney's hand moved briefly to his arm, a gesture of restraint disguised as reassurance. Voss Dynamics paid these 7 entities a combined total of approximately $22 million over the 3-year period for services described in the contracts as strategic advisory, market intelligence, and technical consultation. I reviewed every contract. I found no documentation of any services actually rendered. No reports, no deliverables, no meeting records, no correspondence about the substance of any engagement, just invoices and payments. In your professional experience, Diana asked, what does that pattern suggest? It suggests the contracts were created to justify payments rather than to document services. The money was transferred to these shell entities and then moved through a series of intermediate accounts before ultimately reaching offshore holdings I traced to Mr. Voss's control. She moved to the second cluster on the screen. Component 2, offshore accounts. I traced funds to 17 separate accounts across accounts in the Cayman Islands, Singapore, and 1 in Liechtenstein. The total amount flowing through these accounts over the 3-year period was approximately $217 million, though a substantial portion of that represents funds that had already been reported on Voss Dynamics corporate books under different descriptions. She zoomed in on a specific column of transactions. To give one concrete example, in September 2022, Mr. Voss submitted an expense report for a business development trip to London. Total claimed expenses: $97,000 first-class flights, hotel suites, client entertainment, ground transportation. I verified with the airline, the hotel, and 2 of the restaurant venues listed. Mr. Voss was in New York for the entire duration of the claimed trip. The $97,000 was wired to a Cayman account 3 days after the expense report was approved. The gallery had gone very quiet. Not the silence of shock, but the focused silence of people absorbing information that was worse than they had expected. How many similar instances did you find? Diana asked. 51 separate expense reports over 3 years, totaling approximately $7.3 million for trips and expenses. I could demonstrate either never occurred or were substantially inflated. Additionally, I identified a pattern of phantom vendor payments fabricated conference fees, and what appear to be falsified receipts for equipment purchases that were never made. She turned a page in her binder. The total amount I was able to trace through these fraudulent expense reports and phantom payments is approximately $8.4 million. And the third component, Renata highlighted the final cluster on the screen. Component 3 is the most direct and, in some ways, the most consequential. Beginning in March 2023, the quarterly dividend distributions from the Chloe Trust, which under the trust terms are designated exclusively for the trust beneficiary, were redirected from the beneficiary's custodial account to an account in Mr. Voss's name at Atlantic Offshore Bank. The screen showed a timeline each quarter, an arrow that should have pointed toward the beneficiary's account, curving instead toward the offshore holding. Over 23 months, the redirected amount totals $5.2 million. This is the sum Mr. Voss proposed as a settlement to Mrs. Voss, which means that the settlement he characterized as generous was funded by money he had no legal right to access, money that belongs to a 16-year-old child. Philip stood for cross-examination with a practiced steadiness that cost him more than it appeared to. Ms. Cruz, isn't it possible that some of these financial structures were established for legitimate tax planning purposes that you simply don't have full visibility into? I have reviewed all of the tax returns filed by Mr. Voss and the associated entities over the relevant period. The offshore accounts were not reported on FBAR forms as required by law. The shell companies claimed business expense deductions for services that my investigation found no evidence were ever provided. If these were legitimate tax structures, they were operated in ways that constituted tax fraud rather than tax planning. But you can't definitively prove that Mr. Voss personally directed these transactions. Renata pulled up a document on the screen and email. The sender's name was Eliot Voss. The recipient was a financial services address in the Caymans. The subject line read, Q3 movement, keep discreet. This email from Mr. Voss's personal account was sent in August 2023. In it, Mr. Voss discusses the routing of the third quarter dividend payment, specifically requesting that it be moved through an intermediate Singapore entity before reaching the primary account to, she read from the document, to minimize audit visibility. She set the tablet down. That is one of 47 emails in this category that I reviewed in which Mr. Voss directly discusses the movement of funds in language consistent with an awareness that the transactions needed to be obscured. Philip sat down. He had nothing else. Your Honor, Diana said, one final question for this witness. What is the total amount of funds Ms. Cruz has traced to accounts under Mr. Voss's control that originated from Voss Dynamics or the Chloe Trust through the means she has described? Renata did not need her documents. $247 million, Your Honor. The number arrived in the room with the particular weight of a figure that is large enough to recategorize everything that follows. Judge Ung set her pen down. $247 million. She repeated in the tone of someone reading the number back to confirm they had heard it correctly. Yes, Your Honor. Across all three categories, shell company payments, fraudulent expense reimbursements, and redirected trust distributions. It was after that number landed after the gallery had absorbed it, and the reporters had typed it, and Philip Hart had briefly closed his eyes that Eliot Voss said the thing that would define the day. He had not meant to speak. He had been managing himself carefully since the morning's first revelations, keeping his jaw locked, and his hands still, and his expression as controlled as a man in his situation could manage. But the number had reached something underneath the control. Those were my dividends. His voice came out tightly. Not quite the register of a man trying to defend himself, more the register of a man who genuinely still did not understand. I'm the CEO. I built that value. I was the one who... You are an employee, Judge Ung said. Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The trust holds the asset. The trust beneficiary is entitled to its distributions. If you redirected those funds without the trustee's authorization, you did not claim what was owed to you. You took what belonged to someone else. She looked at him for a moment with the flat, patient clarity of someone who has made their point and does not intend to repeat it. I strongly suggest you speak with your attorney before you say anything further. Eliot fell silent, But in the silence, Nora finally spoke for only the second time since the morning's opening statements, and in a voice so quiet and so controlled that it seemed somehow to carry farther than anything that had been said by anyone at full volume. "He never read the trust agreement," she said. "He never read the corporate filings. He never read the employment contract that specified what his compensation included and what it did not. He spent 15 years signing things without reading them because reading things was my job." A pause. "I read everything." The silence that followed lasted long enough to feel complete. Judge Young lifted her gavel. "We'll adjourn for the day? Tomorrow at 9 a.m. with complete financial disclosures from both parties. Mr. Hart, full transparency. I won't say it again." The gavel fell. But that evening, in a hotel room in Midtown that cost $900 a night charged to a corporate card that had not yet been frozen, Eliot Voss sat on the edge of the bed in his suit jacket, without the tie, his shoes still on, and worked his way through the contact list on his phone. The board. 3 calls, all of which went to voicemail. He left careful, measured messages that he deleted and re-recorded before sending, trying to sound like a man addressing a manageable situation rather than a man whose situation had stopped being manageable sometime around 10 o'clock that morning. His PR team. 1 call answered. He listened for 90 seconds before the message became clear. The narrative had moved beyond their reach for tonight. The best they could offer was preparation for tomorrow's positioning. His friend Marcus, not his attorney, just a friend from business school who had sent him a congratulatory text after the Voss Dynamics Series C, and who now picked up on the second ring, listened for 4 minutes and said slowly, "Eliot, how much of this did you actually build yourself?" He hung up. He sat for a while with the phone on the bed beside him and looked at the wall of the hotel room, the generic art in its beige frame, the minibar he hadn't opened, the desk where he had placed his briefcase and not yet opened it. 15 years. He tried to remember the specific day at the Blue Anchor Diner on Atlantic Avenue, that cold January evening in 2010 when Nora had been filling napkins and placemats with notation that he had looked at and not understood when she had been explaining something that he had listened to without following because he had been too focused on the part of the conversation he cared about, which was the market strategy and the investor pitch and the product narrative, not the underlying mathematics. He remembered her hands moving over the placement, writing quickly, the pen barely lifting between symbols. He remembered saying something like, "That's brilliant," and meaning it, but not in the way that acknowledged she was the one who had made it brilliant, meaning it in the way of a man who had found something he could use. He had always believed the story. That was the part that was genuinely hard to examine. Not that he had told the story, but that he had at some point stopped being aware that it was a story and started believing it was simply true. That the company was his because he had said it was often enough, loudly enough in rooms full of people who had no reason to question it. That Nora's contribution was the quiet, unremarkable kind support logistics, the boring infrastructure that enabled the real work rather than the real work itself. He had made himself invisible to her so thoroughly that he had made her invisible to himself. He did not have a name for what he was sitting with in that hotel room. It was not remorse. Not yet remorse required the kind of stillness he had not yet achieved. It was something more preliminary than remorse, the disorienting, vertiginous sensation of a story collapsing into something else, something less comfortable, something that required him to occupy a different position in the narrative he had been telling himself for the better part of 2 decades. He thought about Chloe. He had not thought about Chloe in years. That was another story he had told himself, that she was fine, that she had a good life, that the adoption had been the right choice, that it had nothing to do with him, that the trust in her name was simply a structural courtesy that he had never paid attention to because it was Nora's domain, and Nora handled the boring details. $247 million. He thought about the number. He thought about where it had gone. He thought about the 47 emails he had written in careful language about routing and visibility and minimizing audit exposure. And he thought about the version of himself who had written those emails, confident, calculating, certain that he understood exactly what he was doing and certain that it would never be traced. He had not understood anything. At 11:15, Philip called. Eliot let it ring twice before answering. "The DA's office contacted me," Philip said without preamble. "They've been watching the proceedings. Based on the financial evidence submitted today, they've opened a preliminary inquiry. A pause. This is no longer solely a civil matter. Eliot was quiet for a long moment. Through the window, the city glittered with its indifferent, gorgeous abundance, the lights of Midtown reflecting on the wet streets far below the stream of taxis and ride shares and delivery vehicles that never fully stopped regardless of what was happening in courtrooms 3 miles south. "What are my options?" he finally asked. "Tomorrow morning, before court reconvenes, we need to discuss the possibility of initiating a cooperation conversation with the U.S. Attorney's Office. If they're going to build a case getting ahead of it, demonstrating genuine willingness to assist their investigation, providing a full accounting gives us leverage we won't have once they've built the case without us." Philip's voice was careful and even, the tone of someone who had delivered this particular message before and understood that it landed better delivered plainly than softened. "The alternative is that we continue to contest and you face a federal investigation conducted without any cooperation credit." "You're telling me to consider cooperating against myself." "I'm telling you to consider the difference between a man who helps a federal investigation understand a complex financial scheme and a man who forces federal investigators to reconstruct that scheme without him. One of those men has options. The other has a trial date." Eliot set the phone on the bed and looked at the ceiling. He had spent 15 years being the most prominent person in every room he entered. He had given keynote speeches. He had been profiled in magazines. He had sat across tables from venture capitalists and prime ministers and technology editors and looked every one of them in the eye with the easy certainty of a man who had built something real and knew it. He had not built anything. He had marketed something that someone else built. He had put his face on it and his name on it and his signature on documents he hadn't read, and he had called that founding. He had called it vision. He had called it leadership. And it had worked. It had worked for 15 years precisely because the person who had actually built the thing was quiet and methodical and believed for far too long that the credit would eventually find its way to where it belonged. She had been wrong about that. She had stopped being wrong. He picked the phone back up. "What time tomorrow morning?" 7:30, Philip said. "My office. Bring the offshore account documentation you have access to. All of it." The call ended. Eliot sat for a while longer in the $900 hotel room, and then he opened his briefcase and took out the financial documents Philip had requested, account statements, routing records correspondence with the shell company's nominal operators, and spread them on the desk in the order in which they would be easiest to explain. He had always been good at explaining things. He had built an entire career on the ability to take complex technical realities and translate them into simple, compelling stories that people wanted to believe. Tomorrow he would have to explain something that had no compelling story. Only the facts laid out in their honest sequence without any of the narrative scaffolding he had spent 15 years constructing around them. He worked until 2 in the morning and then sat in the silence of the room looking at the documents he had arranged and understood perhaps for the first time that Nora had never needed a compelling story. She had always simply worked with the facts. At 7:15 the next morning, Nora took a call from Jordan Co. She was already dressed, the same navy suit, different blouse, and standing at her desk with the fourth folder open in front of her, reviewing its contents one final time before leaving for the courthouse. The call was brief and to the point, which was Seo's way. "Board meeting concluded 40 minutes ago," he said. "Unanimous. You have the full resolution package. I'll bring the formal documentation to court." "Thank you, Jordan. One more thing. The announcement went to the press wire at 7. It's already moving." She looked out the window at the cold February morning beginning to establish itself over the Upper West Side rooftops. On her phone screen alongside the call display, a notification was already populating from the financial news feed she monitored, Breaking Voss Dynamics board calls, emergency meeting, CEO status under review. By the time she reached the courthouse, the line outside courtroom 9C would be longer than it had been on either of the previous 2 days. She closed the fourth folder, picked up her bag, and walked to the door. The mathematics were about to finish themselves. Across the city in his office on the 43rd floor of a building on Lexington Avenue, Philip Hart sat across from his client at a conference table covered in financial documents and looked at the man he had been representing for the past 3 years with the careful, settled expression of someone who had made peace with a situation before the other person in the room had fully arrived there. "The board took a vote this morning," he said. He had received the same press notification Nora had 30 seconds after it hit the wire. Eliot looked at him. "It's done," Philip said simply. "Before we walk into that courtroom this morning, I need you to understand what you're walking into. This is no longer a divorce proceeding. By the time the session ends today, it will be something significantly more consequential." Eliot picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking. Outside, the February city was moving through its morning. The commuters and the delivery drivers and the students and the people whose ordinary days would not be changed at all by what happened in courtroom 9C on this particular Tuesday in the second week of February. The city did not slow down for private catastrophes. It never had. "I understand," Eliot said. Whether or not he did, they walked out of the office together and made their way toward the courthouse, and behind them on the 43rd floor, the financial documents remained spread across the table in the morning light. The complete accounting of 15 years of choices assembled at last in a single honest arrangement, waiting for the moment when they would be examined by people who had no stake in finding them innocent. The morning was cold. The rain had stopped overnight. The sun was not quite visible through the high, pale clouds, but its light was there, diffuse and even illuminating everything. Tomorrow had arrived, and with it the final chapters of the equation. The line outside courtroom 9C on the morning of the second day stretched not just down the hallway, but around the corner and partway down the stairwell to the floor below. Court officers had established crowd barriers at 7:45. By 8:15, both of the major financial news networks had positioned reporters in the street below the building's windows. The story had traveled overnight with the accelerating efficiency of something that the internet had decided mattered: the tweets and threads and newsletters and podcast teaser clips compounding on each other, until the phrase "the quiet architect" had been coined by a legal blogger at midnight and adopted by approximately everyone by dawn. Inside the courtroom, Eliot arrived at 8:40 without Sloan. He wore a dark suit, not Tom Ford. Something quieter, and his posture had undergone a fundamental change from the 2 previous days. The performance was mostly gone. What remained was a man who had spent the night with the truth of his situation and had arrived at a provisional, uncomfortable acceptance of it. His eyes had the flat, early morning quality of someone who had not slept enough but had not wasted the wakefulness. Philip Hart was already at the table, files open. He did not greet Eliot when he sat down. They had been together for 3 hours that morning and had run out of things to say beyond the procedural. At 8:55, Nora and Diana came through the side door. The gallery responded to Nora's entrance in a way it had not on the previous 2 days, not with noise, but with a focused, almost collective attention. She was carrying 4 folders this morning. The 4th one was new to the public. They had seen 3 the day before, had watched each one opened and deployed with surgical precision, and the addition of a 4th carried an obvious anticipated gravity. Nora set the 4 folders on the table, arranged them with the same precision as always, placed her hands flat, looked at nothing and everything simultaneously. At 9 a.m., Judge Ung entered. "Before we begin," she said, settling into her chair, "I want to note that both parties have submitted their complete financial disclosures as ordered. I have reviewed them overnight." She looked at Philip with the expression of someone who had expected to be surprised and had been. "We have a great deal to cover. Ms. Walsh, your first witness." "The defense calls Renata Cruz to continue her testimony, Your Honor." Renata Cruz was already in her seat in the gallery and rose immediately, returning to the stand with the calm of someone whose work was not yet complete. She accepted the reminder from the clerk that she was still under oath and turned her attention to the exhibit display. "Ms. Cruz," Diana said, "yesterday you outlined the 3-component financial scheme you traced in your investigation. Today, I'd like to go deeper into the documentary evidence, specifically the corporate email communications you reviewed." "Of course." Renata brought up the first exhibit on the display, a thread of emails between Eliot Voss and a financial services contact in Singapore. This is a chain beginning in February 2023 and running through November 2024. In it, Mr. Voss discusses across 47 separate messages the management of what he consistently refers to as his personal reserves funds. He describes in his own words as having been moved off the corporate radar. She scrolled through several excerpts as she spoke, not reading the full content, which had been submitted as a complete exhibit but highlighting key phrases. The recurring language throughout the correspondence includes phrases like, keep this discreet, avoid the quarterly flag, root through the Singapore entity first, and don't want this appearing in the consolidated statements. She looked up. These phrases are consistent with someone who understood that the transactions needed to be obscured from corporate accounting processes. Could this language have an innocent explanation? Diana asked. Hypothetically sophisticated tax planning can involve routing structures, but sophisticated tax planning is documented, reported, and consistent with FBAR requirements. The accounts Mr. Voss is discussing in these emails were not reported on the required federal forms, and the funds were not returned to any legitimate tax-sheltered structure. They were moved into accounts that funded personal expenditures. What kinds of expenditures? Renata brought up a new exhibit, a composite of transaction records, each tagged with a category label in her color-coded system. I traced the funds from the offshore accounts to the following categories of personal spending over the 3-year period: private yacht charters totaling approximately $900,000. First-class travel for 2 persons on 37 separate trips total approximately $700,000. Luxury accommodations at various international properties approximately $420,000. High-end jewelry and personal gifts approximately $380,000. Restaurant and entertainment expenses at premium establishments approximately $290,000. And unspecified cash withdrawals in amounts suggesting personal household expenditure approximately $460,000. She paused. Many of these expenses were also separately submitted as business expenses through Voss Dynamics, and reimbursed, meaning Mr. Voss claimed reimbursement from the company for expenses he was also funding from diverted trust and corporate money. In some instances, the same expense appears in both the company reimbursement records and the offshore account outflows. The gallery had gone entirely still. This was not the dramatic silence of a revelation, it was the heavier silence of accumulation of a picture, becoming clear not through a single stunning detail, but through the relentless patient addition of fact upon fact upon fact. Philip stood. Your Honor, these characterizations are documented in exhibits already submitted to the court, Diana said. Every figure Ms. Cruz has cited is cross-referenced with verifiable records. Judge Ung held up a hand. I'll hear the objection properly, Mr. Hart. Philip set his jaw. The defense is presenting a characterization of these financial activities as fraudulent, based on the assumption that Mr. Voss understood the legal ownership structure of the company and the trust. If our position, which remains that Mr. Voss genuinely believed himself to be the owner, is correct, then what Ms. Cruz describes as diversion is simply a misunderstanding of corporate structure. Diana turned to face him with the patience of someone who has prepared for every version of this argument. Your Honor, the emails in Exhibit 7C include the phrase, "Don't want this appearing in the consolidated statements." If Mr. Voss believed the money was legitimately his, he had no reason to keep it off the corporate books. The language of concealment is itself evidence of awareness. Judge Ung made a note. Overruled. Continue. Diana returned to her witness. Ms. Cruz, what is the total figure of funds you were able to directly trace, not estimate, but directly trace to Mr. Voss's control through the means you've described? $247 million, as I stated yesterday. Of that amount, approximately $62 million can be directly tied to specific personal expenditures I've identified. The remainder is held in offshore accounts that have been frozen pursuant to court order and the cooperation of the relevant financial institutions. And the $5.2 million in redirected Chloe Trust distributions that Mr. Voss offered as a settlement is included in that figure, yes. The proposed settlement was funded entirely from diverted trust assets, not from Mr. Voss's personal earnings or his corporate compensation. Diana looked at Judge Ung. No further questions, Your Honor. Philip's cross-examination was brief and careful. He had learned over the past 2 days the value of not asking questions whose answers he could not control. He made 3 narrow points about the difficulty of proving intent from financial routing decisions, received 3 narrow rebuttals from Renata Cruz that landed with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 420 hours learning exactly this material, and returned to his seat. Renata stepped down. Judge Ung surveyed the room. Ms. Walsh, you have additional witnesses. One, Your Honor. The defense calls Jordan Seo on. Jordan Seo rose from the second row of the gallery with the composed authority of someone who had spent 8 years as the legal conscience of a billion-dollar company and understood exactly what this moment required of him. He was Korean-American in his late 40s, dressed in a suit that split the difference between corporate and courtroom with the ease of someone who occupied both worlds regularly. He took the stand, was sworn in, and settled into the chair with the focused steadiness of a witness who had prepared carefully and intended to say exactly what he had prepared to say. Mr. Seo, what is your role at Voss Dynamics? I am the chief legal officer. I've held that position for 8 years. In that capacity, to whom do you report? My primary reporting obligation is to the board of directors of VD Holdings and to the trustee of the Chloe Trust. My duty as CLO is to the company's legal interests, not to any individual executive's preferences or authority. Eliot looked up at that. A specific, measured look, the look of a man recognizing a sentence that had been drafted to be heard in this room. Mr. Seo, did you review the financial evidence that has been presented in these proceedings? I did. Mrs. Voss provided me with Renata Cruz's full forensic analysis approximately 3 weeks ago. I conducted an independent legal review of the findings and of the corporate and trust documents implicated by them. Philip was immediately on his feet. Your Honor, the CLO of the company under examination is testifying on behalf of the opposing party. This represents a fundamental conflict. I have a legal obligation to the company, Jordan said before Diana could respond. The company is controlled by the Chloe Trust. Mrs. Voss is the trustee of the Chloe Trust. When evidence of systematic fraud committed by an executive of the company was brought to my attention by the person who controls the company's ultimate ownership, I had a clear legal and ethical obligation to investigate and act. He looked at Philip with the dispassionate clarity of someone who had thought this through very carefully before arriving in this room. Mr. Voss is an employee. Mrs. Voss, through the trust, is the company's controlling authority. I work for the company, not for any individual officer. Those are not the same thing. Judge Ing glanced at Philip. Overruled. Continue. Mr. Seo, Diana said. What actions has Voss Dynamics taken in response to the evidence you reviewed? Jordan reached into his briefcase and withdrew a formal document, clean white paper, heavy stock, bearing the corporate header of VD Holdings, LLC. The board of directors of VD Holdings, acting under authority granted by the Chloe Trust, convened an emergency session yesterday evening and reached the following conclusions and resolutions. He looked at the document, though his delivery suggested he had committed it to memory. First, the board finds that the financial activities documented in the forensic analysis constitute gross misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, violation of the company's stated ethics policy, and criminal fraud. Second, these activities constitute a material violation of the morals clause in Mr. Voss's executive employment contract, which provides for immediate termination without severance in cases of confirmed illegal conduct or conduct that brings substantial reputational harm to the organization. The room had gone completely silent. Eliot sat without moving. Jordan continued, his voice level and even. Therefore, effective immediately upon service of this notice, which I am now formally providing in the presence of this court, the following actions are taken by the board. 1. Eliot Voss is terminated from his position as Chief Executive Officer of Voss Dynamics. 2. All associated compensation, deferred benefits, stock option arrangements, to the extent any exist within the employment contract, as distinct from equity ownership which he does not hold, are forfeited. 3. All access to company systems, facilities, accounts, and communications infrastructure is revoked. 4. The board formally recommends that the U.S. Attorney's Office pursue criminal charges in connection with the financial activities documented in the forensic analysis. He set the document down. Additionally, and effective immediately pending formal confirmation at the board's next regular session, the board has appointed an interim chief executive officer to lead the company during the transition. The appointment is unanimous. Diana let a beat pass. Who has the board appointed, Mr. Seo? Jordan Seo looked across the courtroom at the woman sitting at the defense table, the woman who had arrived at 9:15 on the morning of the first day. sat in perfect stillness through 12 hours of proceedings, and watched the truth of the company she had built emerge piece by piece from the documentation she had assembled with the patience of someone who had understood from the beginning that mathematics always balances. Nora Voss, he said, is the interim chief executive officer of Voss Dynamics, effective immediately. Rache. The courtroom did not erupt the way it had at some of the morning's previous revelations. It did something different. It exhaled collectively and deeply, as though a pressure that had been building for 15 years had finally found its release. Eliot rose from his chair. It was not the controlled, deliberate movement of a man making a point. It was something more involuntary, the reflex of a man whose body was responding to what his mind had not yet fully processed. The board doesn't have the authority to... The board has complete authority to terminate a CEO for cause, Jordan said with the flat certainty of someone who had reviewed every applicable document 3 times. Fraud is cause. Breach of fiduciary duty is cause. The employment contract is explicit, and the trust which controls the board's authority is controlled by Mrs. Voss. He looked at Eliot with something that was not unkind, something closer to the measured regard of a man who had watched this situation develop for years and had made his peace with what it required of him. You never read the documents, Eliot. I know, but they exist and they are unambiguous and they have been in place for 15 years. I'll fight this. I'll sue. With what standing? Diana asked from the defense table. Her voice was not sharp, but it was precise. You have no ownership stake to defend. You have no employment contract that was not just voided for cause. You have no board relationship that has not been severed. You have at this moment a great deal of legal exposure and very few remaining options. Philip grabbed Eliot's arm. The gesture was firm, urgent, the grip of a man trying to prevent something that would make an already difficult situation dramatically worse. Eliot stood for a moment, his face cycling through expressions that came too fast to isolate rage, disbelief, the specific panic of someone who had always understood the world in terms of his own story and was now standing in a room that had stopped caring about his story. Then Philip said his name quietly and firmly, and Eliot sat down. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, he did not look at Nora. Nora looked at him. It was a brief look measured unreadable to the gallery, carrying in its plainness something that was not triumph and not compassion, but something more complicated than either. The look of someone seeing the end of something that had consumed 15 years of their life and feeling the weight of that even through the clarity of the moment. Then she looked away and said something quietly to Diana, and Diana nodded. Your Honor, Diana said, rising. The defense has one additional witness before we move to the final portion of this morning's session. The defense calls Sloane Mercer. The gallery registered this with a sustained collective murmur that took 3 full seconds to settle. Sloane Mercer was not in the gallery. She had not been present since the previous afternoon when she had departed the courtroom with the careful, self-preserving urgency of someone who had realized that a burning building does not become safer by remaining inside it. But the bailiff now opened the side door and she entered not through the main gallery doors, with the press watching, not clinging to anyone's arm, just a young woman in a conservative black dress walking to the witness stand because she had received a subpoena the previous morning and had, after consultation with her own newly retained attorney, decided that the mathematics of cooperation were more favorable than the mathematics of resistance. She looked different. The practiced confidence of the Instagram persona, the tilted chin, the cultivated ease, the sense of a woman who had built an audience on the performance of her own aspirational life was largely absent. What remained was something younger and less certain. A 27-year-old who had spent the previous 18 months believing one story and the previous 36 hours understanding that the story was false. She settled into the witness chair and looked at Diana with the careful attention of someone who had been thoroughly prepared by her own attorney for this moment. Ms. Mercer, Diana said, how long were you in a relationship with Eliot Voss? Approximately 18 months, beginning in March of last year. How did the relationship begin? He approached me at a tech conference in Miami. We talked for several hours. He was charming and attentive and very clearly interested. He said within the first week that his marriage was essentially over, that he and his wife were incompatible, that he had stayed out of a sense of obligation, that he was planning to leave when the time was right. She was careful with her delivery, the way of someone reciting something she had already told several people and had worked to make accurate each time. He described her as his exact words were that she was brilliant but cold, that she had never really connected with him, that she preferred equations to people. Nora did not react. Did he discuss his professional situation with you? Constantly. It was a significant part of who he presented himself as. He talked about the company in terms that implied he had conceived and built it more or less by himself. He described himself as having developed the core technology from scratch, having built the team, having taken the company from nothing to a billion-dollar valuation through his own vision and execution. Did he ever mention Nora Voss's technical contributions? Sloan paused. He mentioned that she was good at administrative tasks, managing paperwork, handling vendor relationships, keeping the internal operations running. He described it as she was the infrastructure, he was the architecture. She looked briefly at her hands in her lap. I accepted that. I had no reason not to. Ms. Mercer, were you aware of the financial structures that have been described in these proceedings? The offshore accounts, the shell companies? No. The word came out clean and unequivocal. I was not aware of any of that. I knew Eliot was wealthy. I knew the company was worth a great deal. I assumed his personal spending came from his compensation as CEO. She paused. I did not ask. I understand now that not asking was a kind of willful comfort with not knowing, but I genuinely did not know the specifics. Diana brought up a photograph on the display screen. Sloan and Eliot on a yacht in warm waters, cocktail glasses raised the ocean, brilliant behind them. A screenshot from Sloan's podcast's Instagram account. Do you recognize this image? Yes. That was taken in July of last year. Eliot had chartered a yacht in the Bahamas. He described it as a necessary business trip and invited me to join. Did you pay for any portion of that trip? No. Eliot covered everything, the flights, the charter, the hotels before and after. He also purchased me a bracelet during that trip at a jeweler in Nassau. I posted about it on my social media. Diana brought up a second image, the bracelet on Sloan's wrist, professionally composed, tagged with the jeweler's account. You have approximately 3 million podcast and social media subscribers. Is that correct? It was. It's lower now. A slight controlled shift in her expression. The past few days have been difficult for my following. When you posted about this bracelet and about the trip, did you disclose that they were gifts from a man whose company you now know was funded in part by redirected trust distributions belonging to a minor child? No, I had no idea. I want to be clear about that. Sloan looked at Judge Ng rather than at Diana, the instinct of someone who understood that the court was the relevant audience. I understand what the evidence shows about where the money came from. I understand that the life I was posting about was financed in ways I did not know and would not have accepted if I had known. Her voice remained controlled, but something behind it was not entirely steady. I've spoken with the DA's investigators. I've provided full documentation of every gift and trip. I intend to cooperate completely. One final question, Miss Mercer. Did Mr. Voss ever mention his daughter, Chloe? A pause. He told me he and Nora had never had children, that they had decided early in the marriage that children didn't fit their careers. He never mentioned Chloe. Never. Diana looked at the court. No further questions, Your Honor. Philip approached for cross-examination with the particular careful restraint of an attorney who understood that Sloan Mercer had already committed to cooperation with the prosecution and that aggressive questioning would accomplish nothing beyond demonstrating that he was willing to be aggressive. Ms. Mercer, you benefited substantially from your relationship with Mr. Voss. The travel, the gifts, the content for your platform? Yes, Sloan said without waiting for the question to fully form. I benefited from a relationship with a man who I believed was who he said he was. I understand now that he was not. I understand that some of what I received may have to be returned, and I've told the investigators I'm prepared for that. She looked at Philip steadily. If you're suggesting that my having received gifts makes me complicit in fraud I didn't know about, I'd respectfully suggest that's a question for the investigators, not for me. Philip had nothing further. Sloan stepped down. She did not look at Eliot as she passed the plaintiff's table. She sat in the gallery several rows back and folded her hands in her lap with the quiet composure of someone who has already done what needed to be done and is now simply waiting for the room to confirm it. Your Honor, Sim. Diana said, the defense now calls Chloe Voss by video conference. We have received guardian consent from her legal parents and from the court's New Zealand liaison. Chloe has been informed of the nature of these proceedings and has expressed a clear, informed desire to address this court. Philip rose. Your Honor, Chloe Voss is a minor. She is the trust's beneficiary but is not a party to this divorce proceeding. She is the direct victim of the financial activities this court has been examining for 2 days, Diana said. The trust that bears her name was looted. She has a legal and personal stake in the outcome of these proceedings that exceeds that of many witnesses who have already testified. Judge Young was quiet for a moment. Then, how old is she? 16, Your Honor. Another pause. I'll allow it. But Ms. Walsh, this is a courtroom, not a venue for performance. Keep it focused on the relevant facts and her direct experience. Of course, Your Honor. The bailiff activated the video system. The screen on the far wall illuminated and the connection established itself in that slightly too bright way of video calls from great distances. The light quality different, the colors slightly shifted, the sense of looking through something thin and technological at a room on the opposite side of the world. Chloe Voss was sitting in a home office in front of a bookshelf that held a mix of school textbooks and novels and a few small framed photos that were not visible in detail. She wore a gray hoodie and had her dark hair pulled back. She looked from the gallery's perspective startlingly like her mother, the same structure of the face, the same darkness of the eyes, the same quality of absolute attentiveness. She also looked unambiguously like a teenager who was doing something difficult and had decided to do it with complete steadiness. Hello, Chloe. Judge Young said, her voice warmer than it had been at any point in the previous 2 days. Thank you for joining us. Do you understand that you're speaking with a court in New York City in connection with legal proceedings involving your birth parents? Yes, Your Honor. Her voice came through clearly, the New Zealand accent barely present, softened perhaps by the formality of the moment. My adoptive mom, Iris, explained everything. And Aunt Nora has been honest with me about what's been happening here. Aunt Nora. The gallery registered the phrase. Chloe, Diana said, can you tell the court what you know about the Chloe Trust? Aunt Nora set it up when she founded the company. It's named after me. It was supposed to hold the company's ownership and provide distributions that would go into an account for my future university, starting something having a foundation. She explained it to me 2 years ago when she started to understand where things were heading. Chloe paused, and her expression shifted in a way that was both controlled and unmistakably genuine. She told me that the trust was how she had protected the work she'd done, made sure it couldn't be taken from her, and that part of protecting it was making sure it couldn't be taken from me either. And when did you learn about the redirected trust distributions? Aunt Nora told me about 3 weeks ago. She wanted me to hear it from her before it became public. A pause. At first I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding. I thought maybe he'd made an accounting error or hadn't understood the trust terms. Her voice remained steady. And then she showed me the emails, the ones where he specifically discusses hiding it, routing it through different accounts so it wouldn't show up in the right places. She looked directly at the camera. He knew. He knew it wasn't his money, and he took it anyway, and he didn't think about me at all when he did it. The courtroom was very quiet. Chloe, Diana said gently, is there anything you would like to say to this court about the impact of what has happened? Chloe took a careful breath. When she spoke, she had the slightly formal cadence of someone who had thought very hard about what they wanted to say and was delivering it as accurately as possible. I want to say that I'm okay. I have mom and dad, and I have a good life here, and I'm not destroyed by this. Aunt Nora made sure of that when she gave me to my parents, and I want people to understand that, her voice firmed. But I also want to say that what he did is not okay. You can't steal from a child and call it a business decision. You can't pretend someone doesn't exist for 16 years and then act surprised when they have thoughts about what you did to them. She looked at the camera steadily. I've read about him. I looked up his TED Talks and his interviews and all the times he talked about his vision and his genius and what he built. And I kept looking for Aunt Nora in any of it, and she wasn't there. Not once. He had 15 years of interviews, and he couldn't find one moment to say the math at the center of all of this came from someone else. A pause. That's not just fraud. That's a choice about who matters. And I think it's important for this court to understand that I notice that. I notice it, and I am not going to pretend it doesn't mean something. The screen held her expression for a moment after she stopped speaking, the clear dark eyes, the absolute steadiness. Then she said quietly, I hope what happens here makes it harder for this to happen to someone else. That's what Aunt Nora's been building toward. That's what I care about. Connection ended. The screen went dark. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become something more than silence, became a kind of acknowledgement, absorbed by everyone in the room in whatever way each of them was capable of absorbing it. Judge Ung was quiet for several seconds. When she spoke, her voice had the precise, careful quality of someone managing their own response with deliberate effort. Miss Walsh, do you have anything further? No, Your Honor. Diana sat down. The defense rests. Judge Ing looked at Philip. Mr. Hart, does the petitioner wish to present any counter-testimony? Philip stood. He was quiet for a moment that held the particular weight of a man measuring what remains of something he has been trying to preserve. No, Your Honor. He sat back down. Judge Ung removed her reading glasses and let them hang on their chain. She looked at the room, at the reporters and the bloggers and the sketch artists and the spectators and the court officers, all of them waiting for what came next. Then she looked at Eliot Voss. In 25 years on this bench, she said, I have not encountered a case in which the systematic erasure of one person's intellectual contribution, the systematic theft of another person's trust assets, and the systematic construction of a false public identity have been so thoroughly documented and so comprehensively presented. She paused. Mr. Voss, you have spent 15 years inhabiting a story about yourself that was not true. The evidence in this courtroom has made the actual story visible in detail to this court and to a great many other people. I want you to understand that what follows is not punishment for ambition or success. It is consequence for fraud. She looked at her notes. The prenuptial agreement is unenforceable. It cannot protect property that was never the petitioner's separate property to begin with. The company was from its founding held in trust by the respondent. There is nothing for the prenup to govern. She turned a page. All funds diverted from Voss Dynamics and the Chloe Trust, through the methods documented in these proceedings, are hereby ordered, frozen, and returned to the Chloe Trust with interest and applicable penalties. Pending the criminal investigation, I am formally requesting the U.S. Attorney's Office to open in connection with the evidence submitted here. Another page. The petition for divorce is granted on the grounds of fraud, abandonment, and breach of marital duty. The marriage of Eliot Voss and Nora Voss is dissolved effective immediately. The gavel fell, and the empire came down. Not with the dramatic collapse of a structure under sudden force, but in the way that things built on false foundations eventually collapse, steadily, completely. Each piece following the next with the quiet inevitability of mathematics proving what was always true. The gallery did not explode into noise the way it had at some of the morning's previous revelations. It released the collective held breath of 2 days exhaling all at once, making a sound that was both large and somehow appropriate to what had just occurred. Reporters moved for exits. Phones went up. The court TV producer reached for her headset with the satisfaction of someone whose instinct about a story had proven sound in every direction. At the plaintiff's table, Eliot sat perfectly still. He had expected something to happen when the gavel fell, some reflex, some impulse to respond. But there was nothing. There was only the settled, comprehensive reality of what had just been said, and the understanding that he had no remaining move to make. No appeal that would reverse the documented evidence. Oh, no narrative that could be reconstructed from what had been systematically dismantled. No story left to sell. Philip gathered his files with the efficient movements of someone who had already, somewhere in the past 90 minutes, made his peace with the outcome, and was now focused on the next practical steps. He leaned close to Eliot and spoke quietly for several minutes. Not strategy anymore, but logistics. What the cooperation conversation with the U.S. attorney would look like. When it needed to happen. What the difference would be between a man who got ahead of the criminal inquiry and a man who waited for it to arrive. Eliot listened. He nodded occasionally. His face held the particular stillness of someone who had stopped fighting the tide. At the defense table, Diana was packing her battered leather messenger bag with the same unhurried thoroughness she had brought to every other action in the past 2 days. She paused at one point to exchange a quiet word with Nora, who nodded once and then stood and smoothed her skirt with the clean, habitual gesture that had accompanied every transition of the proceedings. Nora gathered the 4 folders, each one open now. Each one fully expended their contents, delivered with the precision she had designed them for. She stacked them carefully. She stood. She looked across the courtroom at Eliot. He was looking at the table in front of him. Then, as though aware of being observed, he looked up. They held each other's gaze across the width of courtroom 9C, across 15 years of marriage and 3 years of documentation, and 2 days of everything built on false foundations finally meeting the truth it had been running from. It was not a long look. It did not need to be. What moved across his face in that moment was not something he would have chosen to show anyone. It was unguarded, involuntary, the expression of a man who had at last run out of room to avoid seeing clearly. Not remorse, not yet. Something more: preliminary recognition. The beginning of understanding that the woman he had spent 15 years treating as infrastructure was the one who had built everything, and the one who had, with the patience and precision of a mathematician working a proof she had checked 1,000 times, made the truth impossible to ignore. Nora held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked away. She did not need anything more from this room. Diana touched her arm, and they walked toward the exit. Sat. Outside courtroom 9C, the corridor had become a press scrum of the particular organized chaos that descends when something significant has just concluded and everyone needs to be the first to file. Cameras tracked Nora's movement. Microphones appeared. Questions were shouted from multiple directions at once. Diana steered her toward the elevator. "The side exit," she said. "Car's waiting." But Nora stopped. She stopped in the corridor with the cameras on her and the microphones reaching and the voices asking questions that she had no obligation to answer, and she turned to face the gallery of journalists with the same settled composure she had carried into the courtroom 2 days ago. "Mrs. Voss," someone called. "Do you have a statement?" "Yes," Nora said. "I do." The crowd quieted. She had not prepared these words. They were not from the briefing documents or the legal strategy or the carefully calibrated exhibits. They were simply what was true, stated plainly in the voice of a woman who had spent 15 years being invisible in her own story and was choosing in this corridor to be something else. "For 15 years I built technology in silence, while someone else took credit for it. I convinced myself that patience was partnership and that supporting someone else's narrative was the same thing as being valued. I was wrong." She paused, not for effect, simply because the next part required care. What happened in that courtroom was not revenge. It was documentation. The evidence was real. The fraud was real. The company I built is real. And the consequences that follow are the mathematics of those facts arriving on schedule. A reporter called out, "What's next for Voss Dynamics under your leadership?" "We're going to keep building. The work is solid, the foundation is solid, because it was always built on real mathematics and real engineering. That doesn't change based on who was claiming credit for it. The team that actually built the product is still there, and they're extraordinary." She let a beat pass. "We're going to be honest about who does what. That's not a mission statement. It's just the minimum standard we should have been operating by all along." Another voice. "Any message for other women in your situation?" Nora considered this for a moment with the visible care she brought to everything. "Document your work, date your ideas, save your communications. Not because you expect betrayal, but because protecting your intellectual contribution is professional responsibility the same way any serious person protects any serious asset. And understand that patience is not the same as acceptance. You can be patient and methodical and completely decisive all at once. Those things are not in conflict." She looked at the cameras with the calm directness of someone who had stopped performing anything. Kindness is not weakness, and silence is not the same as not knowing. She turned and walked toward the elevator with Diana, and the corridor behind her was filled with the sound of cameras and typing fingers and voices narrating what they had just witnessed to audiences across the city and the country and the world. The story of a woman who had spent 15 years being erased from her own narrative and had spent 3 years making absolutely certain that when she finally told the truth, there would be nothing left to argue with. The elevator arrived, the doors closed. The building continued its ordinary work around the space she had just occupied. Outside on the wet February street, a car was waiting and the city was already moving on. She had her work. She had her proof. She had the steady, reliable fact of having done something true. The equation was not finished, but the foundation at last was hers. The arrest came 7 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the last of winter's persistence had given way to something cold but no longer hostile, a thin, clear sky over the city that made the streets look scrubbed and honest. The federal marshals arrived at the apartment in Murray Hill at 8 a.m. The building was a step down from the Midtown Hotel, which had been 2 steps down from the Central Park penthouse that had been seized in the first round of asset recovery. The rental was on the 4th floor, 1 bedroom, a galley kitchen windows overlooking an unremarkable stretch of East 34th Street. Eliot had moved in 10 days after the court proceedings ended, carrying a rolling suitcase and 3 cardboard boxes, and had spent the intervening weeks in the particular suspended state of someone waiting for the next phase of a consequence they have stopped trying to prevent. He heard the knock and opened the door without dramatic hesitation. 4 U.S. Marshals, professionally neutral hands at their sides. The lead marshal held up credentials in a document. Eliot Voss. We have a federal arrest warrant on multiple counts, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. I understand, Eliot said. He extended his hands. The cuffs went on with a click that was quieter than he had expected. He had dressed carefully. Not expensively, that window had closed, but with a kind of deliberate plainness that suggested he had thought about how to occupy this moment. Dark slacks, a white button-down, a navy jacket that had survived the asset seizure by virtue of being unremarkable enough to escape notice. He had thought about the photographs that would be taken, the images that would circulate for years as the documented evidence of this particular morning, and he had decided that the appropriate response to being photographed in handcuffs was not to look like a man who had tried to dress for it. The marshals led him through the lobby and into the gray March morning. One camera was already there, a single photographer who had received a tip from somewhere in the process that these things always leak through. The shutter went fast and quiet, capturing images that would appear within the hour on every major news feed. Eliot Voss, former CEO of Voss Dynamics, in an ordinary jacket, hands in cuffs, looking at the ground with the specific expression of a man who has finally stopped constructing a story about himself. The vehicle pulled away from the curb. The processing took most of the day. Fingerprints, photographs, paperwork, the systematic bureaucratic accounting of a person being inducted into federal custody. Eliot answered questions with the single word his court-appointed attorney had prepared him to give, lawyer, in response to anything substantive, and watched the afternoon pass through the narrow institutional quality of its light. His arraignment was the following morning. The courtroom was smaller than courtroom 9C, the audience thinner, no press gallery permission, no court, TV camera. Just a handful of journalists in the back rows, and near the front of the public section, a woman in a navy suit sitting with perfect stillness. Nora. She had not come to watch him arrested. She had not come to the processing facility or to the preliminary hearing or to any of the dozen other procedural markers that his situation had accrued in the weeks since the divorce proceedings. But she was here this morning in the courtroom where the charges would be formally read, and she sat without fanfare, no presence, announcing entrance, no particular arrangement of expression beyond the same quiet attentiveness she had brought to the previous proceedings. She was bearing witness. Eliot saw her when he was led in. He did not look away immediately. He allowed himself to see her, the navy suit, the pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, the hands folded in her lap, and he understood, without needing to examine the understanding closely, that she was not here out of malice. She was here because this was the conclusion of something that had begun 15 years ago, and she had been present at every significant point of that story, and she intended to be present at this one too. The federal prosecutor laid out the charges with clinical precision: 18 counts of wire fraud, 7 counts of embezzlement, 3 counts of money laundering. Potential exposure, if convicted on all counts at trial, was measured in decades. Philip was not present. His retainer had run dry before the arraignment. The public defender, a tired-looking woman named Angela Reyes, who had 43 other clients, and a file on Eliot that was already 3 inches thick, argued for bail with the careful efficiency of someone who knew the outcome before she started. Bail was denied. Eliot Voss would remain in federal custody pending trial. The case was assigned a trial date 7 months out. The gavel fell. In the public gallery, Nora Rose smoothed her skirt and walked out. 3 months before trial, Philip Hart made a single courtesy call to Angela Reyes with a message from Eliot he wanted to cooperate. Full disclosure, complete accounting, the shell companies, the routing structures, the offshore account operators, everything he could document and testify to about how the scheme had been constructed. The U.S. Attorney's Office was interested. Cooperation negotiations took 6 weeks. At the end of them, a plea agreement was reached. Eliot would plead guilty to the major fraud counts, provide comprehensive testimony about the financial architecture of the scheme, agree to full restitution with interest and penalties, and receive a sentencing recommendation of 7 years at a federal minimum security facility with eligibility for early release after 5. The alternative had been trial, and the evidence was what it was. He signed the agreement. The sentencing hearing came in October. The courtroom was different again, quieter. The press presence reduced from the spectacle of the divorce proceedings to the more considered attendance of journalists covering a story's conclusion. Eliot made a statement before the judge delivered the sentence. He had written and rewritten it many times, conscious of the risk of performing remorse in a way that would read as strategic rather than genuine, and had arrived finally at something he thought was honest, even if it was uncomfortable to say. He talked about the choices he had made over 15 years, about the specific psychological machinery by which a person can convince themselves that taking credit for someone else's work is not theft when you've told the story enough times that you believe it yourself. About the moment, not one moment, but many accumulated moments, when he had understood that Nora's contributions were significant and had chosen each time not to say so, not because he had calculated that silence was to his advantage, because he had at some point stopped being able to see her contributions at all. He had made himself unable to see them because seeing them would have required him to occupy a smaller version of his own story. He said he was sorry. Not to the room particularly, not to the cameras. He said it into the specific direction of the seat where Nora was not sitting because she had not come to this hearing. She had sent a letter read into the record by Diana Walsh that was 3 paragraphs long and which said in precise, careful language that she did not seek additional punishment beyond what the facts warranted, that she did not desire his suffering as an end in itself, that she hoped the time he served would be used for genuine examination rather than strategic performance of rehabilitation, and that she had moved on. The judge sentenced him to 7 years. The marshals led him out of the courtroom. Fahad Sami. Voss Dynamics under Nora's leadership had its best quarter in company history in the 3 months following the change of management. It was not a coincidence. It was the result of what happens when the people who actually understand the technology they are working with are allowed to make the decisions, and when the people making decisions are required to be honest about what they know and what they don't. Kayo Duya, freed from the particular friction of an executive who needed every technical decision translated into marketing language before he could sign off on it, moved at a speed that the product development team had not experienced in years. 3 product updates that had been stalled in approval cycles were shipped within 90 days. Client satisfaction metrics rose across every category. 2 institutional clients who had been quietly exploring alternatives extended their contracts. Nora took none of the credit publicly. She gave it to the team explicitly by name in every interview and press release and internal communication. The product updates were credited to Kai and the specific engineers who had built them. The client retention numbers were attributed to the account management team. The strategic direction was presented as collaborative because it was collaborative. She understood from direct personal experience what it cost to have your contributions made invisible, and she had no interest in repeating that pattern in any direction. In December, she gave a keynote address at a Women in Technology conference. The auditorium held 3,000 people, and the overflow crowd watched on screens in an adjacent hall. She had been told the event was sold out within 4 hours of her being announced as the headliner. She stood at the podium and looked at the room at the 3,000 faces that had come from companies and universities and government agencies and startup offices across the country, all of them present at least in part because they knew her story, or some version of it, because they had watched the divorce proceedings, or read the coverage, or recognized in her situation some echo of their own. She talked about invisible labor, about the specific practiced art of making someone's contributions unseen, not through overt aggression, but through the more subtle and deniable method of simply never naming them, never citing them, never giving them a face or a frame. She talked about how the absence of recognition is not the same as the absence of contribution, and how the people who are erased from their own work are often the same people who are most committed to the work itself and least likely to demand acknowledgement. She talked about documentation. Protect your work, she said. Date your ideas. Keep the records. Not because you expect to end up in a courtroom. I didn't want to end up in a courtroom. But because your contributions are real and real things deserve to be witnessed. A pause. And if someone is systematically making your work invisible while benefiting from it, understand that patience and precision are not the same as acceptance. You can be both methodical and decisive. Those are not opposites. The room was very quiet. Kindness is not weakness, she said. And silence, real silence, chosen silence, the silence of someone who is watching and waiting and building an undeniable record of the truth, is not the same as not knowing. The standing ovation lasted 6 minutes. Afterward, women came to find her engineers and researchers and academics and founders, all of them with their own versions of the story, all of them wanting to tell her something or ask her something, or simply to be in the same room with someone who had lived through it and come out the other side with the company intact and her name on the door. She listened to each of them. She gave what advice she could. She took several cards from people whose situations sounded like they could benefit from formal legal support, and she thought standing there in the corridor of the convention center about what it might mean to build something that provided that support systematically, not case by case, as goodwill, but as an institutional resource. She mentioned this to Diana at dinner that evening. Diana was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're describing a foundation." "Yes," Nora said. "I think I am." The Chloe Foundation was incorporated in March of the following year, 14 months after the divorce was finalized, timed to coincide with the return of the last of the diverted trust funds, which had been recovered with interest and penalties and now totaled $6.3 million. Nora directed every dollar of the recovery into the foundation's endowment rather than into the trust's personal distributions. Chloe, when consulted, agreed without hesitation. "I have Mom and Dad," Chloe said on their weekly video call in the tone of someone explaining something obvious. "And you. I'm not going to be the reason some other woman doesn't get the help she needed." The foundation's mission was specific: provide legal support, documentation assistance, and strategic counsel to individuals primarily, but not exclusively, women in technical fields whose intellectual work had been stolen, misattributed, or systematically erased. It partnered with intellectual property attorneys across 12 states in its first year. It created a documentation toolkit, a practical, usable guide to maintaining verifiable records of creative and technical work that was downloaded 400,000 times in its first 6 months. It was funded with a precision that Nora appreciated by the money Eliot had stolen. The irony was not lost on the financial press. Several outlets noted it explicitly in their coverage of the foundation's launch. The man who had built his reputation on someone else's mathematics had, through the mechanism of his own fraud, inadvertently endowed the institution that would help protect the next 1,000 people from the same thing happening to them. Mathematics, as Nora had always understood, was patient and invariable. It did not require the cooperation of the people it was calculating about. It simply waited until the equation resolved. In Pennsylvania, in a minimum security federal facility, Eliot Voss was 3 months into a 7-year sentence. He had enrolled in a GED tutoring program, not because he needed the qualification, but because it gave structure to the days, and because teaching basic mathematics to other inmates turned out to be something he was unexpectedly good at. He had started a journal, not a memoir, not yet just daily entries that were honest in the way that things written for no audience can be honest. He had a therapist provided by the facility's rehabilitation program who asked him questions that were harder to answer than any investor pitch he had ever given. He had written to Chloe twice, both times brief letters. He had not asked for anything from them. No response, no forgiveness, no relationship. He had said what he had understood and acknowledged what he had done and stopped there. He had addressed them from the position of someone who understood that he had forfeited the authority to expect anything in return. Chloe had not responded to the first letter. She had responded briefly to the second in a note that was 3 sentences long and which said, essentially, I received this. I see that you're trying. We'll see. It was Eliot had understood more than he had earned. He kept the note in his notebook. He thought about the company sometimes. He monitored the news when he had access to a tablet during recreation periods, and he read about Voss Dynamics' performance with the particular complicated attention of someone observing a place they used to inhabit, seeing it clearly for the first time from the outside. He read one article in particular published by a technology journal that reviewed the company's technical leadership in detail, interviewing Kai Oduya, two of the senior engineers, and Nora herself, and in which the mathematical foundations of the Athena system were described in print with full attribution for the first time. He read it twice. The second time he read it, something happened in him that was not quite shame and not quite grief, but occupied the same general territory as both. He had known in the abstract that the algorithm had been Nora's. The courtroom had made that undeniable, but reading it described in a journal article with her name attached with her graduate work, cited with Dr. Marsh quoted on the elegance of the original proof, was different from knowing it. It made it specific in a way that the courtroom, for all its precision, had not. He had held the tablet until the recreation hour ended and the officer asked him to return it. He thought about the diner in Brooklyn, the blue placemat with the coffee stain at one corner, and Nora's cramped, precise notation covering every inch of available space. He had sat across from her that night thinking about his pitch deck. She had been writing the algorithm that would become everything. He had looked at her work and seen an asset. He had never understood that she was a person. The facility's rehabilitation program included a weekly group session focused on what the counselors called accountability, mapping a process of tracing specific choices back to the beliefs that had generated them and tracing those beliefs back to the moments where they had been formed. Eliot had approached the first few sessions with the reflexive detachment of a man accustomed to analyzing things, rather than feeling them, and had been informed by the group facilitator, a woman in her 50s who had clearly encountered this response before and found it predictable that analysis was not the same as accountability. He had spent the following week thinking about that. He started a notebook. Not the memoir that the facilitator had suggested might be a useful project he resisted, that framing the grandiosity of a man writing his own cautionary tale for public consumption while still in the early chapters of understanding what had actually happened. Just daily entries honest in the way that things written for no audience can be honest about what he observed in himself on any given day. The entries were short at first. They became longer. The longer ones were harder to write, and he discovered gradually more useful. He wrote over the course of several months a detailed account of how he had constructed the story of himself as the founder and visionary of Voss Dynamics. Not the fraud. The fraud was a late-stage consequence, a symptom of something that had started much earlier. He wrote about the first time Nora had explained the algorithm to him in words he could repeat to an investor without understanding what the words meant, and how the investor had looked at him with the attentive respect of someone receiving important information, and how that look had felt, and what he had done with the feeling. He had reached for it. He had used it. He had organized his life around making sure it kept happening. He had been terrified, he wrote, of being ordinary, of being the man in the room who did not have the genius, who had the ambition and the articulation and the read on what markets would want, but not the fundamental creative intelligence that produced the thing itself. He had found a way to have all of it anyway, by attaching himself to someone who had the thing he lacked, and making sure the attachment was invisible. The entries were not comfortable to write. They were not meant to be. He continued writing them. The Chloe Foundation's first year of operation exceeded every projection Nora and Diana had made when they were designing its scope in the small conference room off Courtroom 9C. The documentation toolkit was downloaded more than 400,000 times. The Foundation's legal partnership network grew from 12 states to 27 within 18 months as IP attorneys across the country recognized the referral relationship as both professionally and financially advantageous. The Foundation handled 114 active cases in its first-year individuals whose intellectual work had been stolen, misattributed, or systematically erased, ranging from engineers whose names had been removed from patent applications to academic researchers whose published work had been appropriated without credit by better-resourced institutions. One case involved a woman who had spent 9 years developing a natural language processing methodology at a tech company in Seattle, only to find it patented under her supervisor's name after a reorganization. The foundation connected her with an IP attorney, supported her documentation review, and helped her build a case that settled favorably before it reached litigation. Another involved a graphic designer in Atlanta, whose visual identity system for a startup had been appropriated and replicated the original creation documents dated, organized, and submitted as part of a formal challenge after the startup's founders had declined to pay her agreed contract and then released the work as their own. Each case was different. Each case was the same in the ways that mattered. Nora read the case summaries when she had time, which was not as often as she would have liked. The company demanded her attention in ways that were productive and occasionally exhausting, and she had learned in the 2 years since taking the CEO role that the most important leadership decision she made every week was which problems to put her energy on directly and which ones to trust her team to carry. She was not Grant Hawthorne, she was not Eliot Voss, she was not a CEO who needed to be the smartest person in every room. She was a CEO who was very good at building the right rooms. Kyoduya had never been happier in his professional life. He said this to her directly on a Tuesday afternoon in the engineering wing without fanfare in the middle of a conversation about the Q3 product roadmap. She had looked at him for a moment before responding. "I'm glad," she said. "The work shows it." "The work always showed it," he said. "Now the conditions show it too." She had written that down when she got back to her office. She had a habit which she had kept since her doctoral years of writing down true things when she encountered them, because true things deserve to be witnessed. Sloan Mercer's situation resolved in a different direction. She had cooperated fully with the U.S. Attorney's investigation, providing complete documentation of every gift and trip and financial arrangement, sitting through 7 hours of interview with the lead investigator, and delivering testimony at a grand jury proceeding that helped establish the timeline of Eliot's offshore account activity. In acknowledgement of her cooperation and the absence of any evidence of knowing participation in the fraud, the prosecutors declined to file charges against her. She returned the bracelet. She returned 3 other pieces of jewelry whose purchase the forensic accounting had traced directly to diverted trust funds. She returned the value of 2 chartered yacht trips calculated to the dollar, with interest. She also, in an episode of her podcast that ran to 93 minutes and was downloaded 14 million times in its first week, told the complete story of her relationship with Eliot Voss. Not a victim narrative she was precise about that in the framing, and returned to the precision whenever the interviewing format she had adopted seemed to be drifting towards something more self-exculpatory. She had believed a man who told her what she wanted to hear. She had not asked the questions she should have asked. She had allowed the aesthetics of wealth to substitute for actual understanding of where the wealth came from. "I was 25 when we met," she said in the portion of the episode that was quoted most widely afterward. "And I am not going to stand here and tell you that 25 excuses everything, but I'm going to tell you that I have spent the last 8 months asking myself hard questions about what I wanted to be true badly enough that I stopped looking at what was actually true. And the answer is I wanted a story. I wanted to be in a story about success and arrival and having made it to somewhere, and he was very good at making that story feel real." She paused. "The woman he was married to was building the actual thing, and I was decorating the fiction, and I think about that a lot." The episode marked a turn in her public presence, not toward spectacle or manufactured growth arc, but toward something more specific and less comfortable. She started covering cases of corporate fraud and intellectual property theft with the same rigorous documentation that had distinguished her true crime work. Her audience dropped, recovered, and rebuilt over 2 years into something smaller and more committed. She never mentioned Eliot Voss again on the podcast. She didn't need to. In the summer following the proceedings, Nora flew to New Zealand. It was the first time she had been there since Chloe was 9 months old, since the visit that had become a stay, that had become a decision, that had become the most consequential and painful choice she had ever made. 20 hours of travel across the international date line with 2 connections and hours of layover. And she spent the entire journey in the particular suspended state of someone moving towards something they have been both anticipating and approaching carefully for a long time. Iris and Daniel Whitfield met her at Auckland Airport. They were warm without being performed about it, the warmth of people who had spent 16 years raising a child and understood in the way you can only understand through practice what Nora had given up and what it had cost her and what she had been trying to protect when she made the choice. Daniel shook her hand and then pulled her into a brief, unannounced hug that lasted exactly the right amount of time. Iris held both of her hands for a moment and looked at her with the clear, assessing warmth of someone who had been paying attention to Nora's situation from 6,000 miles away and was glad to see her looking like herself. Chloe was standing a few steps back. She was taller than the video calls suggested, almost Nora's height, with the long-legged build of someone who had spent her adolescence on the rugby fields and hiking tracks of the North Island. She had Nora's face, but Iris's way of standing, and she moved forward when Nora appeared with the slightly careful, deliberate quality of someone who has thought about a moment in advance and is now discovering what it actually feels like in real time. "Hi, Aunt Nora," she said. They embraced. It was brief and a little awkward in the way of two people who love each other and have never had a physical language for it, and then it settled into something more comfortable, and they stood for a moment on the arrivals concourse of Auckland Airport with the ordinary world moving around them. "You look tired," Chloe said. 20 hours of travel. You should have flown direct." "There isn't a direct flight from New York to Auckland." "There should be." Chloe picked up one of Nora's bags with the unthinking physical confidence of someone who had grown up doing useful things. "Come on, Mum made dinner." They spent 2 weeks together. Nora stayed in a small cottage on the property, close enough to feel present, far enough to honor the household's rhythms and the relationships it had built over 16 years without her. They had dinner together every evening, the four of them, and sometimes Chloe's friends who treated Nora with the politely curious regard of teenagers meeting someone they've heard a great deal about and are forming their own views of. One afternoon, while Daniel was at work and Iris was in town, Nora and Chloe drove to a beach on the west coast, black sand, high dunes, the Tasman Sea, moving with the particular restless gray energy of cold southern water. They walked for an hour without talking much the way you can, when the silence is comfortable rather than avoidant. Eventually, Chloe said, "Are you actually okay?" Nora considered this. "Yes, not performatively, actually. Because a lot of it was a lot. Even watching from here." "It was a lot," Nora agreed. "But it's also finished. That particular chapter is finished." She looked at the water. "I've been building toward the next one for a while. The foundation, and the new research, and the company being actually well run." She glanced at Chloe. "And this?" Chloe was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about university," she said. "What I want to study. I know, you mentioned mathematics and computer science. I want to build on what you started, the adaptive learning work." She spoke carefully the way she did when she was saying something important and wanted to be precise about it. "Not to replicate it, to take it somewhere it hasn't gone yet. I've been reading the technical papers from Voss Dynamics, and I can see where the next problems are." Nora stopped walking. She looked at her daughter, at the dark eyes that were the same as hers, at the way she held herself, at the quality of precision in how she spoke about mathematical problems. And she felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite pride, and was fully both of those things at once. "You can see the next problems," she repeated. "Yes." Chloe looked at her steadily. "So can you?" "I'd guess." "Yes," Nora said. "I can." They looked at each other across the space between them, the space that was the distance of a choice made 16 years ago, and also not a distance at all because the connection had never been severed, only expressed differently than the conventional form. "Would you want to work on them try, Chloe asked. "Not now. When I'm further along. Unofficially the way Dr. Marsh did with you." "I would be honored," Nora said. The Tasman moved behind them, gray and constant. They walked back to the car together, talking about the problems, the specific, technical, beautiful problems, at the edge of what was understood, and by the time they reached the parking area, they had already covered half a whiteboard's worth of ground in the air. Between them, two mathematicians discovering a shared language that had been waiting for this moment to become itself. In her office, on the 14th floor of the Voss Dynamics building, her name on the door, her company genuinely hers. Nora reviewed the Q4 board report and thought about the next phase of the adaptive learning research. The problem she was working on now was harder than the one she had solved in that Brooklyn diner 15 years ago, and she was working on it in the open with her name attached in a building full of people who understood exactly who had built what. On her desk was a framed photograph, Nora and Chloe and Iris and Daniel seated on the porch of a house overlooking hills that rolled green toward the ocean. Chloe was laughing at something someone had said just before the shutter clicked, head tilted back, eyes bright, entirely unguarded in the way of someone who has grown up in a house where she is completely safe to be herself. There was also a postcard propped against the corner of the monitor. It had arrived 3 weeks ago, postmarked from a federal facility in Pennsylvania. No return address on the card itself, but the handwriting was legible and careful and said, "I read the journal article. I understand now what I didn't understand then. I am glad the work has your name on it." Nora had read it twice. She had placed it against the monitor where she could see it during the workday, not out of sentimentality, but because it was evidence of something that the equation, the full and complete equation of 15 years, was still working itself toward its final resolution. The consequences were real, and that understanding was possible even when it arrived late. She was not waiting for him to become someone different. That was his work, and his work alone. But she had no interest in requiring that he fail at it. She picked up her pencil and returned to the proof. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. And now, finally, she was the one who would do it, seen, credited, and entirely irrevocably herself. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, Voss Dynamics published a technical white paper on second-generation adaptive learning architectures that generated more attention in the AI research community than anything the company had produced in its first decade. The paper was authored by Kai Oduya, 3 senior engineers, and Nora Voss. Her name appeared first on the author list as the principal investigator, which was how attribution worked when you were the one who had defined the central problem and developed the core mathematical framework that the rest of the work extended. The paper was cited within its first 6 months by 42 research institutions. It appeared in the syllabus of graduate courses at MIT Stanford and Carnegie Mellon. Dr. Edward Marsh, who had retired from teaching but not from reading, sent Nora a handwritten note that said simply, "This is the next step. I'm glad you're the one who took it." She kept the note in her desk alongside Eliot's postcard. Not because they meant the same thing they didn't, but because both were evidence of the same underlying truth that real work done over time by someone who genuinely understands what they are doing eventually becomes undeniable. Chloe had just turned 18 when the paper was published. She sent Nora a message the evening it appeared online. "I've been reading this for 3 hours. I have 6 pages of questions. Can we call this weekend?" They called on Saturday morning New Zealand time, which was Friday evening in New York. They talked for 2 hours. Chloe's questions were genuinely good. The kind of questions that are not really requests for explanation, but rather the probing of a mind that has already understood most of the answer and wants to test the edges. Nora answered each one carefully and asked several questions in return, and by the end of the call she understood that Chloe's acceptance letter from MIT, which arrived 3 weeks later, was not a surprise and had probably been inevitable since the conversation on the beach. The Chloe Foundation's 3rd annual conference was held in the main auditorium at Voss Dynamics headquarters, the company's largest space, which had once displayed a timeline of the company's history with Eliot's photograph at every significant milestone, and now displayed a different kind of timeline. The technical innovations of the Athena platform, credited to the people who had actually produced them, annotated with the dates and documentation trails that proved it. 500 women attended. Engineers, researchers, academics, founders, executives, and a substantial contingent of legal professionals who had come not as subjects of the conference's work, but as allies of it. The Foundation's legal partnership network had grown to 31 states. It had taken on 214 cases in 2 years, secured favorable outcomes in 147, and was in active proceedings on 63 more. Nora stood at the podium in the auditorium she had built from work she had done, looked at 500 faces, and said what was true. 3 years ago, I walked into a courtroom carrying 3 manila folders and a 15-year paper trail. I had spent 3 years building that evidence because I understood from direct experience that truth without documentation is just testimony, and testimony can be disputed, minimized, explained away. Documentation is different. Documentation is what remains when someone tries to make you invisible in your own story. She looked at the room. You are all here because you have your own versions of this experience. Some of you are in the middle of it. Some of you got out the other side with your work intact. Some of you are still picking up the pieces. And I want to say something to all three groups. The version of this story that ends well is not the version where you are a quieter, more accommodating version of yourself. It's the version where you are precisely who you are with the records to prove it and the patience to wait until the truth can be made undeniable. A pause. Document your work, know your worth, and understand that the people who are trying to make you invisible are almost always people who are afraid of what becomes visible about them when you're fully seen. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. It would have lasted longer, but Nora raised a hand and said, "There are people here with actual cases who need to meet with the foundation team before end of day. The work is more important than the applause." The room laughed and sat down. It was several attendees noted in their write-ups afterward the most characteristic Nora Voss moment they could imagine, precise, direct, and oriented entirely toward the substance of what needed to happen next. Eliot Voss was released from federal custody after 4 years and 3 months, having earned early release through conduct that the facility's assessment board described as genuine rather than strategic, a distinction they had learned over years to make with some precision. He emerged on a Tuesday morning in October into the Pennsylvania autumn carrying a bag and $200 in gate money and a manuscript that had grown over 4 years of evenings and weekends and the particular uninterrupted time that incarceration provides to nearly 500 pages of dense, honest self-examination. His therapist had suggested it might have value as a case study in the psychology of self-deception at an organizational level. Eliot had decided to think about that later. He found work quicker than he had expected. A nonprofit in Philadelphia that provided financial literacy training to workforce development programs needed someone who could explain corporate accounting structures in terms that people without formal education in finance could understand. The program director, a woman named Clara Torres, who had spent 22 years in social work and had no particular interest in his former reputation, interviewed him for 40 minutes, asked direct questions about his fraud conviction, accepted his answers with the focused attention of someone filing them away for later evaluation, and offered him a position at a rate that was by any objective measure reasonable for the work. He accepted without negotiating the salary. That was new. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Germantown. He reported weekly to his parole officer, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra Reyes, who had heard every version of the reformed executive narrative and measured all of them by the same standard, consistent behavior over time. Not words. She and Eliot had an understanding. He showed up. He was honest. She evaluated what she observed. He attended therapy twice a month with a psychologist in Center City who specialized in what she called occupational identity collapse, the specific disorientation that attaches itself to people who have built their entire sense of self around a role or status that no longer exists. He had gone into the first session expecting to find the experience tedious and had instead found it harder than anything he had done in 4 years of incarceration because it required a quality of honesty that he had spent decades systematically avoiding. He took long walks in the evenings along the Wissahickon Creek, which wound through the northwest part of the city, through something that was genuinely wild by urban standards, trees over the waterhawks, the particular quiet of a path that had been there longer than the city around it. He had never in the years when he had access to a penthouse overlooking Central Park been a person who went on walks. He became in Germantown a person who went on walks. He was not sure what that meant exactly, but it felt like a change in the right direction. He called his mother on Sundays. He had not done this consistently in 15 years. His mother, who had maintained a careful diplomatic neutrality throughout the proceedings and the incarceration, began in the second month of the calls to say things she had clearly been holding for a long time. He listened. He did not defend himself. He asked questions. The calls became longer. At the nonprofit, he discovered something unexpected. He was genuinely good at the work. Not because the work was easy, explaining corporate structures to people who had been locked out of those structures by circumstance was harder than explaining them to Harvard. MBA students who had the vocabulary to receive the information, but because it required him to understand things deeply rather than just compellingly. You couldn't charm someone into understanding a balance sheet. You had to actually know what you were talking about and care whether they understood and notice when they didn't and try a different approach. He found that he cared. This surprised him more than almost anything else about his life in Philadelphia. One of his students, a woman named Deja, who was transitioning from warehouse logistics into small business management, approached him after a session one afternoon and said carefully, "You know you're good at this, like genuinely good. You're not trying to be good at it. You just are." He had thought about that for a long time afterward. He had spent 15 years being good at performing vision. He had spent 4 years in a federal facility being taught what honesty actually required. He was apparently spending this chapter being good at something without needing the world to know about it. He was not sure yet whether he deserved to feel satisfied about that. He thought probably the appropriate response was to continue doing it and let the assessment come later from sources more reliable than himself. He wrote the letter to the Legal Ethics Journal in the 3rd year of his sentence. His therapist at the facility had suggested it, and he had resisted for months, for the obvious reason that a disgraced executive writing publicly about his own psychology of fraud was a thing that could easily become another form of performance, the spectacle of a man presenting his own shame for an audience in a way that was at its core still about the audience. He wrote 4 drafts that he rejected on exactly these grounds, before writing a 5th that he showed to his therapist, who read it carefully and said, "This one you wrote for yourself." He sent it. The journal published it. It was assigned in business ethics courses at 14 universities within the first year. He did not receive any compensation and had not asked for any. 3 people wrote to him in response through the journal's forwarding service, all of them men who had recognized something of themselves in the account and were trying to understand how they had arrived at the places they currently occupied. He wrote back to all 3. The correspondence with one of them was ongoing. The coffee meeting in Cambridge happened in June. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of early summer day when Cambridge achieves a quality of leafy academic warmth that made even its most crowded intersections feel like illustrations of something pleasant. He arrived 10 minutes early and ordered coffee and sat with it untouched and watched the street with the particular alertness of someone who was aware that this moment was significant and did not want to miss any of it by being in his own head. When he saw Chloe and Nora crossing the street together, his first thought, unguarded before the social processing could edit it, was that they moved alike. The same kind of economy of motion, the same quality of being entirely present in the physical space they occupied without requiring the space to accommodate them. He had known Nora for 20 years and had never noticed this about her. He noticed it now from across a Cambridge street in the company of a daughter who had been raised on the other side of the world by different parents, and the noticing carried the particular weight of understanding arriving too late to be useful in the way it should have been. He stood when they approached. He said their names. He sat across from his daughter for the first time in any meaningful sense. He had seen her on a screen in the video conference testimony, but that had been different. She had been addressing the court, and he had been the subject of the address. This was the 2 of them across a table in the June afternoon, with coffee and the sounds of the street and the full unmediated reality of each other. She looked like Nora and like someone entirely herself, which was the only way to describe it accurately. She asked him her questions with the directness he had come to expect from the letters and the one brief email exchange. She pressed on his answers when they were vague, not aggressively, but with the quiet insistence of someone who understood the difference between an answer and an explanation that sounds like an answer. He found sitting across from her that he did not want to give her the explanation that sounds like an answer. He wanted to give her the actual answer, even when the actual answer was uncomfortable, because she deserved the actual answer, and he had spent enough of her lifetime giving everyone around him the other kind. He told her about the workshop sessions at the nonprofit. He told her about the walls of his apartment in Germantown, which were bare because he had not bought art for them, and had come to think of the bare walls as a kind of honesty, a refusal to curate an environment designed to make a statement about the person living there. He told her about the Wissahickon and the Hawks, and the Sunday calls with his mother. He told her about the ethics paper and the 3 people who had written back, and the correspondence with the one that was still ongoing. She listened. She made notes briefly on her phone, not because she was recording anything, but because she thought in lists and found that noting things helped her organize them accurately. After an hour, she said what she had said about the right frame. He said what he had said about understanding it. He meant it. He had learned over 4 years in a federal facility and 8 months in Germantown that meaning things required you to know the difference between what you wanted to be true and what was actually true, and to say the second even when the first was more comfortable. He was still learning the difference. It was not a skill you mastered, only one you practiced, but he was practicing it. When Nora said she had come for Chloe, he acknowledged it. When she accepted his thank you with a single nod and walked away across the street with their daughter, he watched them go and felt something that was not quite loss and not quite resolution, but occupied the territory between them, the specific clear feeling of standing at the end of something without pretending it was the beginning of something else. He gathered his things and walked to the bus stop. The bus came. He got on. He found a seat by the window and watched Cambridge pass. He thought about the Blue Anchor Diner, the placemat, the specific quality of attention with which Nora had been writing that night, entirely absorbed the pen moving with the confidence of someone following something she could already see while he had been half present, his mind running the pitch deck she was not in. He had been sitting across from a genius at work and had seen support staff. He did not think there was a way to have that back. He did not think the appropriate response to that understanding was to feel sorry for himself. He thought the appropriate response was to spend the rest of his life doing work that was honest in ways that mattered to people, and to accept that this would not be recognized by anyone except the people it directly helped, and to find that sufficient. He thought it might be eventually. He was not there yet, but the direction was clear. The bus moved through the city, and behind him, Cambridge continued into its afternoon, and 2 blocks away, 2 mathematicians, one who had built the foundation of a company from a proof sketched on a diner placemat, and one who was starting to see the problems that came next, walked side by side toward whatever came next. The Chloe Foundation's 3rd annual conference filled every seat in the Voss Dynamics Auditorium and the overflow room, and generated a wait list of 400 people who had not been able to attend and were watching the live stream. Nora had not expected it to grow this fast. She had built the foundation with the same patient, rigorous attention she brought to everything, but the scale of the response, the need distributed widely across industries and career levels and geographies for exactly this kind of support, exceeded the model she had initially designed for. They had expanded the legal partnership network 3 times. They had hired a full-time executive director, a formidably capable woman named Priya Mehta, who had previously run a civil rights legal aid organization and understood systems with the same fluency Nora brought to mathematics. The documentation toolkit had been downloaded more than 1 million times. The foundation had been cited in proposed federal legislation around intellectual property attribution at publicly funded research institutions. The work, in other words, was working. Nora stood at the podium and looked at the room at the 500 people who had come because they needed this to exist, or because they wanted to help make it exist, or because the story of a woman who had spent 15 years being erased from her own narrative and had then made the truth undeniable had reached something in them that recognition does when it finds something it has been looking for. She said what she had to say plainly. She did not perform it. Afterward, Diana Walsh found her in the corridor and stood beside her for a moment in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been through something significant together and have arrived at a place beyond the need to narrate it. "What's next?" Diana asked. "The research," Nora said. "Chloe has found the next problem. I'm going to help her work it through. And the company? Kai has it. He's always had it, honestly. I'm going to start stepping back from the operational side and spending more time on the technical work." She paused. "That's where I should have been the whole time." "You needed to do the other part first." "Yes." She looked at the auditorium where the evening's last conversations were still ongoing. People exchanging cards, making plans, the beginning of collaborations that would take years to fully manifest. "I needed to make it so that doing the technical work was possible for me, and for people like me. Now I have. Now I can do what I was always trying to do." Diana nodded. She understood. Yet, 10 years after the day she had walked into courtroom 9C with 3 manila folders and 15 years of documented truth, Nora Voss stood in the Voss Dynamics atrium and watched the unveiling of the company's new permanent installation. It was not a portrait. She had declined the portrait. It was a recreation rendered in high-resolution photography on a 12-foot wall of the original placemat from the Blue Anchor Diner in Brooklyn, coffee-stained grease-marked at one corner covered in her cramped mathematical notation. Beside it, in crisp modern typography, the explanation. The algorithm that became the Athena AI platform, conceived by Dr. Nora Voss, January 14, 2010. Beneath that smaller, the work was always real. Now so is the attribution. Kyoduya stood beside her. He looked at the wall for a moment and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the wall did not already say better. The atrium was full of people, employees, board members, journalists, representatives from the Chloe Foundation. Dr. Marsh in his corduroy jacket, looking pleased and slightly tearful in the way of someone who has lived long enough to watch good things come full circle. Chloe was there, back from a research residency in Edinburgh, standing near the back of the crowd with the slightly removed attentiveness of a person who is observing something significant and wants to see it clearly. She had Nora's eyes and Iris's way of standing and her own particular quality of mathematical attention that was neither of them and entirely itself. After the event, after the photographs and the conversations and the tour of the new engineering wing that Nora had been asked to lead and had done with the quiet, satisfied competence of someone entirely at home in the work, she sat alone for a few minutes in the conference room where 10 years ago she had sat with Diana Walsh and opened the first of 3 folders and said, "He never read what he signed." The room was the same room. The fluorescent light still did something slightly unflattering to the color of the walls. The window still looked out on the gap between buildings, the same air shaft, the same narrow slice of sky. She sat in the silence of it for a moment. She thought about the 15 years before the courtroom, the work done in silence, the credit given elsewhere, the slow accumulation of evidence that no one had asked her to collect, because no one had imagined she was collecting it. She thought about the 3 years of meticulous preparation, the months of proceedings, the day the gavel fell, and the marriage was dissolved, and the company became legally, officially, in every way that mattered, what it had always actually been hers. She thought about Chloe on a beach in New Zealand saying, "I can see where the next problems are." She thought about Kai saying, "Now the conditions show it too." She thought about Dr. Marsh's handwritten note and Eliot's postcard, and the sound of the standing ovation in the auditorium this evening, and she held all of it without needing any of it to mean more than it meant. It was enough. All of it was enough. She stood, gathered her notebook, the current one full of problems she was working on, annotated with observations and partial proofs and questions she had not yet answered, and walked out to find Chloe, who was waiting in the lobby with her own notebook and a coffee, and the expression of someone who has several pages of questions and is ready to begin. They sat down at a table by the window, the city glittering through the glass behind them, and Chloe opened her notebook to the first page of problems, and Nora opened hers, and they began. The work continued, it always had, and now at last completely and on terms she had built herself from the ground up. The world knew exactly whose work it was and who would carry it forward, and what it meant for the women who came after them, who would build the next things on foundations that were finally honestly theirs. Mathematics balances the equation. It simply requires patience, precision, and the willingness to let the truth be seen. Nora Voss had always had all 3. She had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. He lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Germantown. He reported weekly to his parole officer. He attended therapy twice a month. He called his mother on Sundays, which he had not done consistently in the 15 years when he had been too important for it, and which he now did without exception. He took long walks in the evenings along the Wissahickon Creek, which was genuinely beautiful in a way that the expensive neighborhoods he had inhabited before had not been, because it was not designed to impress anyone. He had written to Chloe 3 times since his release. She had responded to the second and third letters briefly, without warmth exactly, but without hostility either. She told him about MIT. She told him about the research she was starting. She told him she had read his public letter, the one he had published in a legal ethics journal a year before his release, that described the mechanisms by which he had constructed his false public identity. The careful, systematic account of how he had convinced himself step by step that his erasure of Nora was not erasure, but simply the natural order of how successful people and their support systems relate to each other. She had written in response to the letter I read this 3 times. I think you understand what you did. I'm not sure yet whether that's the same as having changed, but it's more than I expected. He had written back. That's a fair distinction. I intend to demonstrate the difference over time. She had not responded to that one. She didn't need to. He wrote to Nora once through the Foundation's contact channel because Diana had been clear that direct contact with Nora was not something he should attempt without her explicit consent. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. He explained what he understood now that he had not understood then. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for anything. He said he was glad the company was succeeding and that he hoped the work she was doing with the Foundation was making things better for people who needed it to, and that he intended to spend the rest of his professional life being honest in ways that he had not been. He had not received a response. He had not expected one. He had needed to send it anyway. In the spring of Chloe's second year at MIT, Nora flew to Cambridge. It was not a difficult trip. New York to Boston was barely an hour by train, and Nora had learned in the 2 years since Chloe had arrived at MIT to make the journey casually, the way you make the journey to visit someone who is part of your life, rather than someone you are visiting out of obligation. They had developed a rhythm dinner every 6 weeks or so, more often, when Chloe was working through a problem that benefited from conversation video calls on Sunday evenings, and the kind of ongoing textual dialogue that mathematics facilitates between people who think in similar structures. On this particular afternoon, they were sitting in Chloe's small office in the mathematics building, a shared space, 4 desks. 3 of them occupied by graduate students who had cleared out when Nora arrived, because someone on the floor recognized her, and the resulting quiet suggestion had rippled through the department faster than Nora would have preferred, and working through a specific problem in the adaptive architecture research that Chloe had been stuck on for 3 weeks. The problem was genuinely hard. Nora had looked at Chloe's notes when she arrived and understood within 10 minutes why it had been resistant. The solution required a mathematical approach that existed in a different subdomain from where Chloe had been looking for it, and finding it required a lateral move that was not intuitive unless you had spent a significant amount of time in both areas. She showed her. Chloe looked at the approach for a long moment. Then she looked up, and the expression on her face was one that Nora recognized had seen on her own face, she suspected, in the early years when a mathematical path she had been building toward suddenly opened, and the shape of the answer became visible for the first time. That's it, Chloe said. That's the whole thing. The implementation will take some time to work out. Yes, but I can see it now. I know where it goes. She looked at the notebook, then at Nora. How did you know to look there? Dr. Marsh showed me something adjacent years ago, and I filed it away. You work in enough different areas, and the connections start to become visible. Chloe made a note. Then she set the pen down and looked at Nora with the directness that had been characteristic of her since childhood, the quality of someone who does not edit their attention out of politeness. He emailed me, she said. Eliot. Nora waited. He's been out for 8 months. He's working at a nonprofit in Philadelphia. He asked if I'd be willing to meet him. Coffee somewhere public, no expectations. She paused. He was careful about the language. He said he wasn't asking for anything except the chance to let me see who he is now, with the understanding that I should trust what I observe rather than what he tells me about himself. Nora absorbed this. What do you want to do? She asked. I think I want to meet him. Chloe held her gaze. I've been thinking about whether I would know if he'd actually changed or if I'd just be watching a more sophisticated performance. And I decided I think I'd know. The way you know when a proof is sound versus when it's been made to look sound. There's a difference in how it holds up when you press on it. That's a good test. It's the one you've always used. Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Cambridge in the spring was doing what spring does in New England. Tentative and then sudden, the trees not quite committed yet, but the light already changed. I'll go with you if you want me there, she said. Not to participate, just to be present. Chloe nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. They met on a Thursday afternoon in June at an outdoor cafe near the MIT campus. The table was in the sun. Chloe had chosen it specifically because she wanted to be able to see him clearly. Eliot arrived before them. He was already seated, a cup of coffee in front of him, wearing ordinary clothes, dark jeans, a white shirt, nothing that tried to announce anything. He looked older. He looked like someone who had stopped spending energy on the performance of not looking older. He stood when he saw them approaching, not with the instinctive, fluid confidence of the man who had entered courtroom 9C 2 years ago, but with the more careful, deliberate movement of someone who understood that standing was the appropriate thing to do here and was choosing it consciously. "Chloe," he said, and then looking at Nora with an expression she had not seen on him before, something without pretense in it, without calculation, without the reflexive assembly of a face designed to produce a specific effect, "Nora." "Eliot, she said. They sat. Chloe did the talking, mostly asking the questions she had prepared, and the ones that emerged from the answers listening with the focused precision she brought to every inquiry. Eliot answered without performance. He said he didn't know when he didn't know. He acknowledged contradictions in his account when Chloe identified them rather than smoothing them over. He talked about his work at the nonprofit with the plain enthusiasm of someone who had found something they were genuinely good at and had stopped needing that goodness to be accompanied by prestige. After an hour, Chloe said, "I'm going to think about this, whether we should see each other again." "That's reasonable," Eliot said. "Take whatever time you need." "I'm not doing this for you," Chloe said clearly, without cruelty. "I'm doing it for myself, to find out if you're someone I want to know. That's the only frame I'm operating in." "I understand," Eliot said. "That's the right frame." Nora had been silent throughout. Now Eliot looked at her. "I read the Foundation's annual report," he said. "What you've built it's real and good. I wanted to say that." He paused. "I know you don't need me to say it, but I wanted to say it anyway." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said, not warmly, not coldly, simply as a fact, the acknowledgement of two people who had shared 15 years and were now at a distance that was appropriate and would remain so, speaking plainly to each other about what was true. They rose to leave. Chloe walked ahead already on her phone, already back in her day. Eliot and Nora stood for a moment in the June afternoon, the city moving around them. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I came for Chloe." "I know." A pause. "But thank you." She nodded once. Then she walked toward Chloe, and they crossed the street together, and behind them Eliot Voss gathered his things and walked in the other direction toward the bus stop, toward his ordinary life in Philadelphia, toward the long and unspectacular work of becoming someone worth knowing. 10 years after the day she had walked into courtroom 9C with 3 manila folders and 15 years of documented truth, Nora Voss stood in the Voss Dynamics atrium and watched the unveiling of the company's new permanent installation. It was not a portrait. She had declined the portrait. It was a recreation rendered in high-resolution photography on a 12-foot wall of the original placemat from the Blue Anchor Diner in Brooklyn, coffee-stained grease-marked at one corner, covered in her cramped mathematical notation. Beside it in crisp, modern typography, the explanation, the algorithm that became the Athena AI platform, conceived by Dr. Nora Voss, January 14, 2010. Beneath that smaller, "the work was always real." Now so is the attribution. Kyoduya stood beside her. He looked at the wall for a moment and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the wall did not already say better. The atrium was full of people, employees, board members, journalists, representatives from the Chloe Foundation, Dr. Marsh, in his corduroy jacket, looking pleased and slightly tearful in the way of someone who has lived long enough to watch good things come full circle. Chloe was there, back from a research residency in Edinburgh, standing near the back of the crowd with the slightly removed attentiveness of a person who is observing something significant and wants to see it clearly. She had Nora's eyes and Iris's way of standing and her own particular quality of mathematical attention that was neither of them and entirely itself. After the event, after the photographs and the conversations, and the tour of the new engineering wing that Nora had been asked to lead, and had done with the quiet, satisfied competence of someone entirely at home in the work. She sat alone for a few minutes in the conference room where, 10 years ago, she had sat with Diana Walsh and opened the first of 3 folders and said, "He never read what he signed." The room was the same room. The fluorescent lights still did something slightly unflattering to the color of the walls. The window still looked out on the gap between buildings. She sat in the silence of it for a moment in the full and ordinary quiet of a life that was genuinely hers. Then she stood, gathered her notebook, the current one full of problems she was working on, and walked out to find Chloe, who was waiting in the lobby with her own notebook and a coffee, and the expression of someone who has several pages of questions and is ready to begin. The work continued. It always did. And now, at last, completely irreversibly, the world knew exactly whose work it was.